Wyoming Territory, 1878. 3 days of waiting had turned Evelyn Porter's dreams to dust. The stage stop was empty, her fiancé was a ghost, and her money was gone. Then a stranger rode out of the sunset and said 5 words that changed everything. "No more waiting, ma'am." But Caleb Mercer wasn't just any cowboy. He was hunting the man who destroyed her life. This is the story of a woman who lost everything and found something she never expected. Stay with me until the end and comment with your city so I can see how far this story travels across the world. The wind that swept across the Wyoming Territory in late autumn of 1878 carried more than dust and tumbleweeds. It carried the broken dreams of those foolish enough to believe in promises made by ink and paper. Evelyn Porter understood this now, sitting on a splintered bench outside Jacobson's stage stop, her traveling trunk beside her like a tombstone marking the death of everything she'd hoped for. 3 days. 72 hours of watching the horizon, waiting for a man who would never come. The sun was beginning its slow descent behind the distant mountains, painting the sky in shades of amber and blood red, and Evelyn wondered if this was what the end of the world looked like. Beautiful and terrible all at once. Her hands trembled as she clutched the crumpled letters she'd read so many times the words had begun to blur. Promises of love, of a ranch house with windows facing east to catch the morning sun, of a life built together in this wild, untamed country. All lies. The lace handkerchief her mother had given her before she died was now damp with tears, twisted between her fingers until the delicate threads threatened to break. Just like everything else in her life, Evelyn thought bitterly. Beautiful things that couldn't withstand the harsh reality of the world. "Ma'am, I hate to be indelicate," came the gravelly voice of Mr. Jacobson, the stage stop proprietor. "But you can't stay here indefinitely. The next stage won't come through for another week, and even then—" He trailed off, his weathered face creasing with something that might have been pity or might have been annoyance. With men like Jacobson, it was hard to tell the difference. Evelyn forced herself to meet his eyes, though the effort cost her what little pride she had left. "I understand, Mr. Jacobson. I need to think." "Thinking won't put a roof over your head or food in your belly," he said, not unkindly. "And the temperature drops fast once the sun goes down. You don't want to be out here when night falls proper." She knew he was right. The high plains of Wyoming weren't like the tree-lined streets of Philadelphia, where she'd spent her entire life before this disastrous journey west. Here, nature didn't compromise. It didn't care about broken hearts or empty pockets. It simply was, indifferent and absolute. I'll figure something out," she whispered, but the words sounded hollow even to her own ears. Jacobson lingered a moment longer, then shook his head and retreated into the warmth of his establishment, leaving Evelyn alone with her thoughts and the gathering darkness. Through the window, she could see him speaking to his wife, both of them casting glances in her direction. She didn't need to hear their words to know what they were saying. Another foolish Eastern woman lured west by pretty letters and prettier lies. The worst part was they were right. Evelyn had been so careful all her life. After her parents died of fever when she was 19, leaving her with a modest inheritance and a small house in Philadelphia, she'd managed her affairs with prudent attention to detail. She'd invested wisely, lived modestly, and resisted the many suitors who'd come calling with empty pockets and charming smiles. She'd known better than to trust easily. Until Thomas Langford's letters began arriving. The first one had come 18 months ago, forwarded by a mutual acquaintance, a woman from Evelyn's church who'd moved west with her husband. The letter was articulate, thoughtful, and refreshingly honest about the hardships of frontier life. Thomas hadn't promised her easy comfort or instant wealth. He'd spoken of building something together, of patience and partnership. He'd quoted Wordsworth and asked her opinions on everything from agriculture to politics. Over the months that followed, their correspondence had deepened into something that felt real and substantial. He'd sent her a tintype photograph, a handsome man with kind eyes and a strong jaw, standing beside a partially constructed ranch house. He'd described his land, his cattle, his dreams for the future. And slowly, carefully, Evelyn had allowed herself to hope. When he'd proposed marriage through a letter that arrived last spring, she'd said yes. The engagement had been unorthodox by Philadelphia standards. But the West was different, everyone said. People did things differently out here. Love could be built on a foundation of shared values and honest communication, couldn't it? It didn't have to begin with fancy courtships and chaperone dances, or so she'd told herself. The arrangements had taken months. She'd sold her house, converted her inheritance to cash, and booked passage on the Transcontinental Railroad. Thomas had sent detailed instructions. She was to take the train to Cheyenne, then the stage to this remote outpost where he would meet her. From there, they would travel together to his ranch, stopping in the nearest town to be married by a justice of the peace. Simple, practical, perfect. Except Thomas Langford had never appeared. The first day of waiting, Evelyn had been patient. Delays happened in frontier country, weather, livestock emergencies, any number of reasonable explanations. The second day, her patience had frayed into worry. By the third day, worry had curdled into a sick, creeping certainty that something was terribly wrong. She'd sent telegrams to the address he'd given her. No response. She'd asked Mr. Jacobson if he knew of a ranch owned by Thomas Langford anywhere in the territory. The man had scratched his head, consulted with several passing travelers, and come up empty. No one had heard of Thomas Langford. No one knew of his ranch. It was as if the man had never existed. But he had existed enough to convince Evelyn to wire him $500 3 weeks ago, money he'd claimed was needed for urgent repairs to the ranch house before her arrival. Money that would ensure they had a proper home to begin their life together. Money that was now gone, along with her security and her future. Evelyn closed her eyes against the hot sting of fresh tears. She'd been so stupid, so unforgivably naive. Every warning sign had been there. The lack of specific details about his location, the constant excuses for why they couldn't meet in a more populated area, the urgent need for funds. She'd ignored them all because she'd wanted so desperately to believe in the beautiful story his letters had painted. Now she sat at a dusty stage stop in the middle of nowhere, with exactly $47 to her name, no prospects, no family, and no idea what to do next. The temperature was dropping just as Jacobson had warned. Evelyn pulled her traveling cloak tighter around her shoulders, but the wool that had seemed adequate in Philadelphia felt paper-thin against the Wyoming wind. She would have to swallow her pride and ask Jacobson for shelter, maybe offer to work in exchange for room and board until she could figure out her next move. The prospect made her stomach twist with humiliation, but what choice did she have? That's when she heard the hoofbeats. At first she thought it was her imagination, the desperate wishful thinking of a woman who'd spent 3 days watching the horizon for a savior who would never come. But the sound grew steadily louder, rhythmic and purposeful, and when she opened her eyes, she saw him. A lone rider, emerging from the dying light like something out of a dime novel. He sat tall in the saddle, his broad shoulders silhouetted against the amber sky, his horse moving at an easy lope that spoke of miles already traveled and the stamina for miles more. As he drew closer, Evelyn could make out more details. A dark hat pulled low over his eyes, a long duster coat that had seen better days, and something about the way he carried himself that suggested capability and quiet confidence. The rider slowed as he approached the stage stop, and Evelyn felt a flutter of something she couldn't quite name. Hope? Fear? She'd learned not to trust strangers bearing promises, but there was something in this man's bearing that seemed different from the smooth charm of Thomas Langford's letters. He dismounted with the fluid grace of someone who'd spent more time on horseback than on foot, looping his reins over the hitching post with practiced efficiency. Only then did he turn his full attention to Evelyn, and she found herself unable to look away. His face was weathered by sun and wind, lined with experiences she could only guess at, but his eyes, gray as a winter storm, held an unexpected gentleness. He studied her for a long moment, taking in her tear-stained face, her expensive but now dusty traveling clothes, the trunk that represented everything she owned in the world. Then he spoke, his voice low and steady, carrying a hint of something that might have been Texas or Kansas or some other place where the land shaped men into something harder than the East could understand. "No more waiting, ma'am," he said, and those 4 simple words hit Evelyn like a physical blow. "You've been lied to." She couldn't speak. Her throat had closed around a sob that was part relief and part despair. How did this stranger know? How could he possibly understand the depth of her humiliation and loss? He took a step closer, and she noticed the badge partially concealed beneath his coat, a silver shield that caught the fading light. Not just a cowboy, then. Something more official. Something that might mean salvation or might mean more trouble than she was already in. "My name is Caleb Mercer," he continued, his tone remaining gentle despite the weight of what he was saying. "I'm a Pinkerton agent, and I've been tracking a confidence man who goes by several names. One of them is Thomas Langford." The world seemed to tilt sideways. Evelyn gripped the edge of the bench, her knuckles white against the weathered wood. You know him?" "I know of him," Caleb corrected, "and I know what he does. Writes letters to respectable women back east, promises them marriage, a ranch, a new life, gets them to send money, sometimes convinces them to come west to meet him. Then he disappears with whatever he can take." "How many?" Evelyn heard herself ask. "How many women has he done this to?" Caleb's jaw tightened. "At least a dozen that we know of. Probably more. He's careful, moves around, changes his name. But he makes mistakes, and he's been leaving a trail I've been following for the better part of a year." "Why?" The question came out as barely a whisper. "Why would someone do this?" "Money," Caleb said simply. "And because he can. Because women like you, smart, careful, respectable women, don't expect to be targets. You think con men prey on the foolish and the desperate, but Langford specializes in exactly the opposite. He targets women who have something worth taking." The casual way he said "women like you" might have been insulting if it hadn't been so accurate. Evelyn had thought herself above such deception. Her pride had been part of her downfall. "So what now?" she asked, proud that her voice didn't break. "You found another one of his victims. Do you need me to file a report? Give a statement? I'm afraid I can't tell you much. I never actually met the man, and I have no idea where he really is." Something flickered across Caleb's face, surprise maybe, or respect. He'd probably expected tears or hysterics. Evelyn had used up all her tears over the past 3 days. All that remained was a cold, bitter clarity. "I do need a statement eventually," he acknowledged. "But right now, I need to make sure you're taken care of. When's the next stage?" "A week. Mr. Jacobson says it might be longer depending on the weather." Caleb glanced toward the stage stop, then back at Evelyn. She saw him taking in the details, her exhaustion, her obvious vulnerability, the way the approaching darkness seemed to be closing in around her. "You got money for lodging?" he asked bluntly. Evelyn's face burned. "Some. Not much." "Family back east? Someone who could wire you funds?" She shook her head. "No one. My parents are dead. I have a few distant cousins, but we're not close. They didn't approve of my coming west." "I bet they didn't," Caleb muttered, but there was no judgment in his tone. He was quiet for a moment, thinking, and Evelyn found herself studying his face. There were scars there, a thin white line along his jaw, another that disappeared into his hairline. This was a man who'd lived a hard life, but there was something in his eyes that suggested he hadn't let that hardness consume him entirely. Finally, he seemed to come to a decision. "I've got a ranch about half a day's ride from here. Small operation, cattle, some horses. I run it with the help of a couple of hands when I'm not working cases for Pinkerton. Right now, I need someone who can manage the books, handle correspondence, keep things organized when I'm out on the trail." Evelyn stared at him. "You're offering me a job?" "I'm offering you a chance to catch your breath and figure out your next move," he corrected. "Honest work, fair wages, and a place to stay that's safer than sitting out here hoping Jacobson doesn't decide you're more trouble than you're worth." It was too good to be true. It had to be. Evelyn had already learned that lesson. When something seemed perfect, it was probably a trap. "Why?" she demanded, her voice sharp with suspicion. "You don't know me. I could be lying about everything. I could be the con artist." To her surprise, Caleb smiled, a small, tired expression that made him look years younger. "Fair question. The truth is, Langford already took something from me. Not money, something more important. And I've been chasing him long enough to recognize his handiwork when I see it. You're not a liar, Miss Porter. You're just someone who made the mistake of trusting the wrong man." "How do you know my name?" "I've been watching this stage stop for 3 days, same as you've been sitting on that bench. I knew Langford had lured someone here. I was waiting to see if he'd show up to complete his con or if he'd already moved on. When you kept waiting, kept hoping, I figured he'd already gotten what he wanted and disappeared. The thought of this stranger watching her humiliation for 3 days should have been mortifying, but Evelyn found she was too exhausted to care. You said he took something from you. What? Caleb's expression shuddered, the brief warmth disappearing behind a wall of professional distance. That's a story for another time. Right now, we need to get you somewhere warm before it gets full dark. So what do you say, Miss Porter? You willing to take a chance on a stranger's offer of honest work? Evelyn looked at him, really looked at him. There was nothing slick or charming about Caleb Mercer. He was rough-edged and direct, his offer almost painfully practical. No promises of love or romance. No talk of building a future together. Just work, wages, and temporary shelter. Maybe that was exactly what she needed. I don't owe you anything? She asked carefully. Not a damn thing, he confirmed. You do the work, you earn the wages. You decide it's not for you, you leave. Simple as that. And Thomas Langford? Are you still hunting him? Every day until I find him. Something in his tone sent a chill down Evelyn's spine. Not fear, but recognition. This man wasn't driven by simple justice or even duty. This was personal. Whatever Langford had taken from him, it had left a wound that hadn't healed. Will you kill him? She asked quietly. Caleb held her gaze. I'll bring him to justice. What happens after that is up to the courts. It wasn't quite an answer, but it was honest enough. Evelyn made her decision. All right, she said, standing on legs that trembled slightly from 3 days of sitting and waiting. I'll come with you. But I want to be clear, this is temporary, just until I can figure out what to do next. Understood. Caleb moved to help her with her trunk, lifting it as if it weighed nothing. We'll ride out at first light. I'll arrange lodging for you tonight at the stage stop. I can... Evelyn started to protest, pride flaring up despite everything. I can expense it to Pinkerton, Caleb interrupted smoothly. You're a witness in an active investigation. The agency pays for witness protection. It was probably a lie, but it was a kind one, and Evelyn found she didn't have the strength to argue. Instead, she followed him into the stage stop, where he spoke quietly with Jacobson and arranged for a room. The proprietor's attitude changed dramatically when he saw the Pinkerton badge. Suddenly, he was all cooperation and concern, as if he hadn't been ready to turn Evelyn out into the cold 20 minutes earlier. Money changed on the counter, and then Evelyn was being shown to a small but clean room at the back of the building. It smelled of lye soap and old wood, but the bed had actual sheets and there was a pitcher of water for washing. Luxury, under the circumstances. I'll be bunking in the common room, Caleb said from the doorway. We'll leave at dawn, pack light. It's a long ride. Evelyn nodded, suddenly unable to speak past the lump in her throat. This strange man had shown her more practical kindness in half an hour than Thomas Langford had in 18 months of beautiful letters. Caleb turned to leave, then paused. Miss Porter? I'm sorry this happened to you. I know that doesn't fix anything, but I am sorry. Then he was gone, leaving Evelyn alone with her thoughts and the growing realization that her life had just taken another dramatic turn. She should have been terrified. She was about to ride off into the wilderness with a man she'd just met, based on nothing but his word and a badge that could have been stolen or forged for all she knew. But somehow, she wasn't afraid. Maybe it was exhaustion. Maybe it was the simple fact that she had nothing left to lose. Or maybe it was something in Caleb Mercer's storm-gray eyes that spoke of honor and hard-earned integrity. Whatever it was, Evelyn Porter fell asleep that night without crying for the first time in 3 days, and dreamed not of the future she'd lost, but of the uncertain one that lay ahead. Dawn came cold and clear, the sky shifting from black to gray to pale gold as Evelyn dressed in her most practical traveling clothes. She'd spent the previous evening sorting through her trunk, separating what she truly needed from the frivolous luxuries she'd packed for a life that would never happen. The fancy dresses, the good china her mother had left her, the silver brush set, all of it seemed absurd now, artifacts from a person she'd stopped being the moment Thomas Langford's deception became clear. She kept the sturdy skirts, the warm shawls, and the leather-bound journal where she'd carefully copied all of Langford's letters. Evidence, Caleb had called it, though Evelyn suspected it was more than that for her. A reminder, perhaps, of how easily she'd been fooled. A cautionary tale written in her own hand. Caleb was waiting in the common room when she emerged, a cup of coffee in his hands and her trunk already loaded on a pack horse he hadn't had the night before. He'd arranged everything while she slept, including what looked like a breakfast of biscuits and bacon wrapped in cloth. "How do you feel about riding?" he asked without preamble. Evelyn blinked. "I've ridden before. Not extensively, but I know the basics." "Good. It'll be faster if you're not riding double with me, and Lady here is gentle enough for a novice." He gestured to a dappled gray mare tied next to his own larger mount. "She belongs to a friend who owes me a favor. You can keep her as long as you need." Another kindness, offered matter-of-factly, as if it cost him nothing. Evelyn was beginning to understand that this was simply how Caleb Mercer operated, quietly capable, solving problems with a minimum of fuss or drama. They ate quickly, mounted up, and rode out as the sun broke fully over the horizon. The Wyoming territory stretched before them in endless waves of golden grass and distant mountains, beautiful and harsh in equal measure. Evelyn had read about the West in books, had studied maps and dreamed of wide-open spaces, but nothing had prepared her for the reality of it, the vastness that made her feel simultaneously insignificant and strangely free. For the first hour, they rode in silence. Caleb set an easy pace, stopping occasionally to let the horses drink from a stream or rest in the shade of the few scattered trees. He seemed comfortable with quiet, never feeling the need to fill the space with unnecessary conversation. It was a relief after the constant chatter of Philadelphia society, where silence was considered awkward and every moment had to be accounted for with words. But as the sun climbed higher and the landscape began to change, Evelyn found her curiosity overwhelming her reserve. "How long have you been with Pinkerton?" she asked. Caleb glanced at her, as if surprised she'd broken the silence. 5 years, give or take, did some ranch work before that, spent time as a deputy in Kansas. Pinkerton seemed like a way to do something that mattered. And does it? Matter, I mean? He considered the question seriously. Sometimes. We catch bad men, recover stolen property, protect people who need protecting, but the agency also does work for railroad companies and mining operations, breaking strikes, intimidating workers. That side of things doesn't sit right with me. His honesty was refreshing. Most men would have painted their work in purely heroic terms, leaving out the uncomfortable complications. "Is that why you focus on cases like mine?" Evelyn pressed. "Con artists and thieves?" "Partly. Also because I'm good at it. Takes a certain kind of patience to track a man like Langford, someone who doesn't rob banks or commit obvious crimes. He lives in the gray areas, makes himself hard to find. Most agents don't want to bother with that kind of work. Too slow, not enough glory." "But you do." "Yeah," he said simply. "I do." They rode on, the conversation lapsing back into comfortable silence. Evelyn found herself studying Caleb when she thought he wasn't looking, the easy way he sat his horse, the constant vigilance in how his eyes scanned the horizon, the weathered strength in his hands. He was probably in his mid-30s, she guessed, but he moved like a man who'd lived twice that many years. Around midday, they stopped to rest and water the horses at a small creek. Caleb unpacked the food he'd brought, more biscuits, some dried beef, and apples that must have cost a small fortune this far from any orchard. "You said Langford took something from you," Evelyn said as they ate. She knew she was pushing, maybe overstepping the boundaries of their brief acquaintance, but something about the isolation and the intimacy of shared travel made her bold. Something more important than money. Caleb's jaw tightened, and for a moment she thought he'd refuse to answer. Then he sighed, setting down his half-eaten apple. "I had a sister," he said quietly. "Caroline. Younger than me by 3 years, smart as a whip, beautiful, full of dreams about seeing the world and making something of herself. Our parents died when she was 17, cholera outbreak in Abilene, where we grew up. I was 20, already working as a ranch hand, trying to make enough to take care of both of us." He paused, staring at something Evelyn couldn't see. A memory, perhaps, or a ghost. Caroline wanted more than what Kansas could offer her. She wanted culture, education, adventure. I couldn't give her that, not on cowboy wages. So when a man started writing to her, Sophisticated letters from San Francisco promising a life of opportunity. I didn't stop her from responding. I thought it was harmless. Maybe even good for her to have something to hope for. Evelyn's stomach dropped. She already knew where this story was going. The man's name was Jonathan Fairfax, Caleb continued, his voice flat now, emotionless. At least, that's what he called himself in the letters. He was educated, wealthy, looking for a wife who appreciated the finer things in life. He courted Caroline for over a year through correspondence. She fell in love with his words, his ideas, his promises. "It was Langford," Evelyn whispered. "It was Langford," Caleb confirmed. "She sold everything we had left from our parents, furniture, her mother's jewelry, even the house I'd been trying to keep up. She converted it all to cash and took a train to San Francisco to marry him. I tried to stop her, but she was 20 years old and convinced she knew better. She promised she'd write, that we'd always stay close." "Did she?" "One letter. Arrived 3 weeks after she left. She said she'd met Jonathan, that he was wonderful, that the wedding was planned for the following month. She was so happy, Evie. I could hear it in every word." The casual use of a nickname barely registered through the horror of what Evelyn was hearing. "That was the last time I heard from her," Caleb said. "I wrote back, got no response. Wrote again. Nothing. Finally, I scraped together enough money to go to San Francisco myself. Took me months to save up and make the trip. When I got there, no one had heard of Jonathan Fairfax. The address Caroline had given me was a boarding house, but the landlady said no one by that name had ever stayed there." "Oh, God," Evelyn breathed. "I searched for 6 months, hired a private detective, talked to the police, showed her photograph to everyone I could find. Finally, I got a lead. A woman in Sacramento who'd been engaged to a man named William Sterling. Same pattern, same con. She told me about others. That's when I understood what Caroline had been caught up in." "Did you ever find her?" Evelyn asked, though she dreaded the answer. Caleb's face could have been carved from stone. "Found a death certificate in Sacramento. Caroline Mercer died of fever 2 years after she left Kansas. She was buried in a pauper's grave because she had no money and no family to claim her." The silence that followed was suffocating. Evelyn felt tears streaming down her face, not for herself this time, but for this young woman she'd never met, who'd had dreams and hopes just like Evelyn's own, and who'd paid for them with everything. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. "I buried her properly," Caleb said, his voice rough. "Bought a headstone, had a service. Then I signed on with Pinkerton and made it my mission to find the man who destroyed her life. Took me a while to pick up his trail. He's careful, changes names, moves around, but he has patterns. He targets certain types of women, uses certain phrases in his letters, always promises just enough to be believable. And he always leaves destruction in his wake." "How many has he done this to?" Evelyn asked again, needing to know. "Confirmed? 15 women that I know of. Some lost money, some lost their reputations. 2, including Caroline, lost their lives. One in childbirth after he abandoned her. Another by her own hand when she couldn't face the shame." Evelyn felt sick. She'd thought her situation was tragic, but at least she was alive. At least she still had a chance to rebuild. "So when you saw me sitting at that stage stop," she said slowly, "you knew exactly what had happened." "I knew," Caleb confirmed. "And I couldn't leave you there, not knowing what I know about how this story usually ends." Understanding dawned. This wasn't just kindness, it was penance. Caleb hadn't been able to save his sister, so he was trying to save Evelyn. "I'm not Caroline," she said gently. His eyes met hers, storm gray and haunted. "No, you're not. But you don't deserve what he did to you any more than she did. And maybe if I can stop him from doing this to even one more woman, maybe that means something." They sat in silence after that, the weight of shared grief and anger hanging between them. Finally, Caleb stood, brushing off his pants. "We should keep moving. Want to make the ranch before nightfall." The rest of the journey passed in contemplative quiet. Evelyn's mind was racing, processing everything she'd learned. Caleb Mercer wasn't just a Pinkerton agent doing his job. He was a man on a mission of vengeance, or justice, depending on how you looked at it, and she'd somehow become entangled in it. She should have been frightened, should have been questioning her decision to ride off into the wilderness with a man driven by such dark purpose. But instead she felt an unexpected sense of solidarity. They'd both been damaged by Thomas Langford, both lost things that couldn't be recovered. In a strange way, that made them allies. As the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, they crested a rise and Caleb pointed ahead. There, that's home. Evelyn followed his gesture and saw a valley spreading below them, green with late-season grass and crossed by a silver thread of river. At the valley's center stood a small ranch, house, barn, and several outbuildings arranged in neat efficiency. Smoke rose from the chimney, a welcoming sign of warmth and life. "It's beautiful," she said, and meant it. "It's functional," Caleb corrected, but there was pride in his voice. "Built most of it myself between cases. The hands keep things running when I'm gone." As they rode down into the valley, Evelyn caught sight of cattle grazing in the distance and horses in a corral near the barn. Two men emerged from the barn as they approached, one older with gray in his beard, the other younger, but with the same weathered look of someone who'd spent his life outdoors. "Boss," the younger one called out, "didn't expect you back so soon." "Plans changed, Tommy," Caleb replied, dismounting. "This is Miss Evelyn Porter. She'll be staying in the guest room and helping with the books and correspondence. Evie, this is Tommy Reeves and his uncle, Sam." Both men tipped their hats respectfully, though Evelyn didn't miss the curious glances they exchanged. The boss bringing home a strange woman was clearly unusual. "Ma'am," Sam said in a gravelly voice, "welcome to Mercer Ranch. It ain't fancy, but it's honest work and good people." "That's all I need," Evelyn replied, surprised by how true the words were. Caleb helped her dismount and retrieved her trunk from the pack horse. "Sam, can you and Tommy see to the horses? I'll get Miss Porter settled." The house was smaller than Evelyn's Philadelphia home had been, but it was solid and well-maintained. The main room served as both kitchen and living area, with a large stone fireplace dominating one wall. A door led to what was clearly Caleb's bedroom, and a ladder climbed to a loft where Sam and Tommy likely slept. Another door opened onto a small room with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a window that looked out over the valley. "It's not much," Caleb said, setting her trunk at the foot of the bed. "But it's private and secure." "It's perfect," Evelyn said honestly. After 3 days on a bench at a stage stop and the prospect of homelessness, this simple room felt like paradise. Caleb nodded, looking uncomfortable with her gratitude. "I'll let you settle in. Sam usually makes dinner around sundown. Nothing fancy, stew and biscuits mostly, but it's filling. You're welcome to join us or take a plate in here if you'd prefer." "I'll join you," Evelyn said firmly. "If I'm going to be working here, I should get to know everyone." Something like approval flickered in Caleb's eyes. "All right then. I'll be outside if you need anything." After he left, Evelyn sat on the edge of the bed and looked around her new home. Temporary home, she reminded herself. This was just a pause, a chance to catch her breath and figure out her next move. She wasn't going to make the mistake of putting down roots again, not after what had happened with Thomas. But as she unpacked her few belongings and arranged them in the small room, Evelyn couldn't shake the feeling that she'd stumbled into something larger than simple employment. Caleb Mercer was hunting a dangerous man, driven by a grief that had shaped the last years of his life. And somehow, without quite meaning to, Evelyn had become part of that hunt. The question was whether that made her a partner or just another victim waiting to happen. Outside her window, the sun was setting over the Wyoming mountains, painting the sky in shades of fire and gold. Tomorrow, she thought, she would start her new work. She would prove herself useful, earn her keep, and begin the slow process of rebuilding her shattered life. But tonight, for the first time since Thomas Langford's betrayal, Evelyn Porter felt something that might have been hope stirring in her chest. It was fragile and uncertain, as likely to break as to grow, but it was there. And for now, that was enough. Dinner that first night was an education in frontier life. Sam had indeed made stew, a hearty concoction of beef, potatoes, and whatever vegetables had survived in the root cellar. And the biscuits were dense enough to serve as weapons if necessary. But the food was hot and plentiful, and the conversation around the rough-hewn table was surprisingly easy. "So, Miss Porter," Tommy said, spooning up his third helping of stew, "the boss says you'll be helping with the books. You got experience with that kind of work?" Evelyn nodded, grateful for a question she could answer with confidence. I managed my own household accounts in Philadelphia for several years. I'm familiar with ledgers, correspondence, and basic bookkeeping practices. Sam grunted approvingly. Good. Caleb here is decent with numbers but hates the paperwork side of things. Always behind on filing reports with the Cattlemen's Association, responding to buyers, that sort of thing. Drives me crazy trying to keep track of everything. I'm a rancher, not a clerk, Caleb protested mildly, but there was no real heat in it. I prefer working with my hands. You prefer avoiding anything that requires sitting still for more than 5 minutes, Sam countered, and Tommy laughed. The easy banter between the three men spoke of long familiarity and mutual respect. This wasn't just employer and employees, this was something closer to family. Evelyn felt a pang of envy. She'd had no one like this in Philadelphia, no one who knew her well enough to tease her or challenge her comfortably. How long have you worked here? She asked Sam. Since Caleb bought the place 4 years back, the older man replied. I'd been working a spread up north that got sold off. Caleb offered me a job, a place to stay, and the chance to bring my nephew along when his parents passed. Been here ever since. And you don't mind him being gone so often? With the Pinkerton work? Sam shrugged. It's his calling. Man's got to follow what drives him, even if it means the rest of us pick up the slack. Besides, the ranch mostly runs itself as long as you know what you're doing. We manage. Sam's being modest, Caleb interjected. He could run this place blindfolded. I'm just the name on the deed. After dinner, Sam and Tommy excused themselves to the bunkhouse. Apparently the loft was reserved for when weather made the short walk impossible, leaving Evelyn and Caleb alone in the main room. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting dancing shadows on the walls, and the silence that fell between them was weighted with unspoken questions. Caleb poured 2 cups of coffee and handed one to Evelyn. I should show you where everything is tomorrow. The office is in the barn, not fancy, but it's quiet and has a decent desk. All the ledgers and correspondence files are there. What exactly needs to be done? Evelyn asked, wrapping her hands around the warm cup. Everything, Caleb admitted with a wry smile. I've been letting things pile up for months. There are bills that need to be paid, letters from buyers that need responses, inventory that needs to be recorded. The ranch is profitable, but my organizational skills leave something to be desired. And the Pinkerton work? Do you keep separate records for that? His expression shuddered slightly. Agency business stays separate. But yes, I have files related to active cases. You don't need to worry about those. Evelyn heard the unspoken boundary in his words. She could help with the ranch, but the hunt for Thomas Langford was Caleb's private war. That should have reassured her. She'd had enough of that particular nightmare. But instead, she felt oddly excluded. I want to help, she said quietly. With finding him, I mean. Langford. Caleb's eyes snapped to hers, sharp and assessing. Why? Because he destroyed my life. Because he destroyed your sister's life and who knows how many others. Because someone needs to stop him, and I have information that might be useful. You have letters, Caleb corrected, which I appreciate, and which will be evidence when we catch him. But tracking him down? That's dangerous work, Evie. It's not something I'm willing to involve you in. The nickname again, used so casually, it was clear he didn't even realize he'd said it. Evelyn filed that observation away for later consideration. I'm already involved, she pointed out. The moment I responded to his first letter, I became part of this. And I'd rather be involved actively than sitting on the sidelines waiting for someone else to deliver justice. Caleb was quiet for a long moment, studying her face in the firelight. Whatever he saw there must have satisfied some test, because he finally nodded. All right, but we do this my way. You share what you know, I investigate, and you stay somewhere safe while I do the dangerous parts. Agreed? It wasn't everything Evelyn wanted, but it was a start. Agreed. Good. Then tomorrow, after I show you the ranch accounts, you can tell me everything you remember about your correspondence with Langford. Every detail, no matter how small. Sometimes the things that seem insignificant are exactly what we need. They finished their coffee in companionable silence, and then Evelyn excused herself to her room. It had been the longest day of her life, or at least it felt that way, and exhaustion was pulling at her bones. But as she lay in the narrow bed, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the ranch at night, sleep eluded her. Her mind kept circling back to Caleb's story about his sister. Caroline had been so young, so full of dreams, and Langford had used those dreams to destroy her. How many other Carolines were there? How many other women had trusted the wrong words written in the wrong hand? And more troubling, what would happen when Caleb finally caught up with Thomas Langford? He'd said he would bring the con man to justice, that it would be up to the courts, but Evelyn had seen the look in his eyes when he talked about his sister. That wasn't the expression of a man who trusted the legal system to deliver adequate vengeance. She must have eventually dozed off, because she woke to sunlight streaming through her window and the sound of voices outside. Dressing quickly in a practical skirt and shirtwaist, Evelyn emerged to find the main room empty but a plate of biscuits and bacon keeping warm near the fire. A note in bold handwriting read, "Help yourself. Meet me at the barn when you're ready." See, the barn was larger than it had appeared from a distance, divided into sections for horses, equipment, and storage. Caleb was in what he had called the office, a corner space partitioned off with rough lumber, containing a desk buried under papers, several filing cabinets, and a bookshelf sagging under the weight of ledgers and manuals. "Good morning," he said, looking up from a letter he'd been frowning at. "Sleep well?" "Well enough," Evelyn lied. "Is that the correspondence you mentioned?" Caleb gestured helplessly at the chaos surrounding them. "This is about 3 months' worth. I kept meaning to deal with it, but then I'd get called away on a case, and it became overwhelming," Evelyn finished. She surveyed the disaster with a critical eye, her fingers already itching to impose order on the chaos. "Do you have a system at all? Any way you've been organizing things?" "Chronologically?" Caleb offered weakly. "More or less?" Evelyn couldn't help but smile. "Well, that's a start. All right, here's what we're going to do. You're going to explain to me how the ranch operates, what you buy, what you sell, who your regular contacts are. Then you're going to leave me alone for a few hours while I create an actual organizational system." Relief flooded Caleb's face. "You're sure? It's a lot of work." "I'm sure. I need something to focus on, and apparently you desperately need someone who understands how filing works." For the next hour, Caleb walked her through the basics of ranch management. The operation was simpler than Evelyn had expected. They ran about 200 head of cattle, sold beef to markets in Cheyenne and Denver, and broke horses for sale to the cavalry and private buyers. The profit margins were thin but steady, assuming you didn't mind hard work and uncertainty. "The biggest challenge is weather," Caleb explained. "A bad winter can kill off half your herd if you're not prepared. A drought can destroy your grazing land. You're always gambling against nature out here." But you love it," Evelyn observed. It wasn't a question. Caleb looked around the barn, out toward the valley visible through the open doors. "Yeah," he admitted. "I do. There's something honest about ranching. You work hard. The land rewards you. You make stupid decisions, it punishes you. No politics, no games, just cause and effect." "Unlike tracking con men," Evelyn said. "Unlike tracking con men," he agreed. "That's all games and politics, and trying to think 3 steps ahead of someone who's always thinking 4 steps ahead of you." He left her after that, heading out to help Sam and Tommy with fence repairs. Evelyn rolled up her sleeves, literally, and dove into the paperwork with the focused intensity of someone who desperately needed a problem she could actually solve. The first task was sorting everything into categories: correspondence from buyers, bills from suppliers, reports from the Cattlemen's Association, personal letters, and miscellaneous documents. Once she had basic categories, she could start prioritizing what needed immediate attention versus what could wait. 3 hours later, Evelyn had transformed the office from chaos into something approaching order. Bills were stacked by due date, correspondence was organized by sender, and she'd created a master list of everything that required a response. The ledgers would take longer. She'd need to reconcile accounts and update entries, but at least she now understood the scope of the work. She was deep in the middle of drafting a response to a cattle buyer in Denver when Caleb returned, bringing with him the smell of honest sweat and sunshine. "I brought lunch," he said, holding up a wrapped bundle. "Figured you'd forget to eat if I didn't." He was right, though Evelyn wouldn't have admitted it. They ate together in the office, and she walked him through what she'd accomplished that morning. His expression shifted from impressed to slightly embarrassed as he realized just how behind he'd let things get. "I should have hired someone months ago," he muttered. "Well, you have someone now," Eveline pointed out. "Temporarily, at least." Caleb's eyes met hers, something unreadable passing behind them. "Right. Temporarily." After lunch, Evelyn steered the conversation to what she'd been thinking about all morning. "You said you wanted me to tell you everything I remembered about Langford's letters. Should we do that now?" Caleb hesitated, then nodded. He pulled a notebook from one of the desk drawers. Not the ranch ledgers, but something more personal, and flipped to a blank page. "Start from the beginning," he said. "When did you receive the first letter?" Eveline closed her eyes, thinking back. 18 months ago, March of last year. It came through a woman named Mrs. Helen Bradshaw. She'd been in my church group in Philadelphia before she moved west with her husband. She said she'd met a rancher who was looking for correspondence with an educated woman back east, someone who shared his interests in literature and current affairs. "Did you ever verify that Mrs. Bradshaw actually knew him?" The question made Evelyn pause. No. I assumed she did. Why would she lie?" "She might not have been lying," Caleb said carefully. "Langford often uses intermediaries, people who genuinely believe they're helping a lonely friend find companionship. He's good at manipulating even the people who think they're helping him." The thought that Mrs. Bradshaw, kind, well-meaning Mrs. Bradshaw, had been duped just like Evelyn was somehow even more disturbing. "What did the first letter say?" Caleb prompted. Evelyn retrieved her journal from her room. She'd brought it to the office earlier, and flipped to the pages where she'd meticulously copied each letter. He introduced himself as Thomas Langford, owner of a cattle ranch in Wyoming Territory. He said he'd been ranching for 10 years, that he'd built his operation from nothing, and that he missed the intellectual stimulation of educated conversation. Did he ask for anything in that first letter? No, he was almost restrained. He asked about my interests, what I liked to read, whether I followed politics. It felt like a genuine attempt to connect with someone who shared his values. Caleb was taking notes, his handwriting surprisingly neat. And the second letter? Arrived 3 weeks later. He responded to everything I'd said in my reply, which made me feel heard. He quoted Wordsworth. I'd mentioned loving the Romantic poets, and shared his thoughts on westward expansion and its impact on indigenous peoples. He seemed thoughtful, progressive even. "He is thoughtful," Caleb said grimly. "That's part of what makes him so dangerous. He's educated, well-read, and he knows how to mirror back whatever the woman wants to hear." "Did he send a photograph?" "Not until the 6th letter, about 4 months into our correspondence. I'd asked several times, and he'd made excuses. The nearest photographer was too far away. He was self-conscious about his appearance, that sort of thing. When he finally sent one, he apologized for the delay." Evelyn pulled the tintype from her journal and handed it to Caleb. He studied it intently, and she saw his jaw tighten. "That's not Langford," he said flatly. Evelyn felt the room tilt. "What?" "This photograph. It's not him. I've seen 2 verified images of Thomas Langford, or whatever his real name is, and he looks nothing like this." Caleb tapped the tintype. "This is just some random rancher, probably someone he paid to pose for a photograph, or maybe even someone whose picture he stole." The realization was another layer of betrayal. Evelyn had spent months staring at that photograph, memorizing the features of the man she thought she'd marry. She traced her finger over the image when she was lonely, imagining what it would be like to see that face in person. And it had all been a lie, just another layer of deception. "Then I have no idea what he actually looks like," she whispered. "Neither do most of his victims," Caleb said gently. "That's part of his method. He keeps himself abstract, unknowable. By the time women realize they've been fooled, they can't even give a proper description to the authorities." They continued going through the letters chronologically, with Caleb asking detailed questions about everything, timing, specific phrases, any mention of places or people. Evelyn found herself reliving the entire courtship, seeing the manipulation she'd been blind to the first time through. The turning point had come after about a year of correspondence. Langford had mentioned needing to make repairs to the ranch house before winter, improvements that would make it suitable for a wife. The costs were higher than expected, and he was worried about cash flow. He hadn't asked for money, not directly, but the implication was clear. "I offered, Evelyn admitted, shame burning her cheeks. He protested at first, said he couldn't possibly accept. But I insisted. I had the money from selling my parents' house, and what was I saving it for if not to build a future with the man I loved? How much did you send? Caleb asked quietly. $500. It was about a third of my total savings. Evelyn laughed bitterly. I thought I was being prudent, not sending everything at once. I actually congratulated myself on being cautious. And after you sent the money? His letters became more frequent, more affectionate. He started talking about marriage, about me coming west. He said the house was almost ready, that he couldn't wait to show me everything he'd built. He proposed in a letter that arrived last spring, quoted Elizabeth Barrett Browning, and called me his anchor in a chaotic world. Caleb's expression was carefully neutral, but Evelyn could see the tension in his shoulders. How long between the proposal and your journey west? 6 months. I had to sell my house, arrange my affairs, work up the courage to actually do it. He was patient, said he understood I was giving up everything I knew. Every letter reassured me I was making the right choice. And then he told you to come to Jacobson's stage stop. Yes. He was very specific about the timing, the route I should take. He said it was the closest stop to his ranch, that he'd meet me there, and we'd travel together to the property. We'd stop in a nearby town to be married by a justice of the peace, then continue to the ranch. Evelyn's voice broke slightly. It all made perfect sense, until he never showed up. Caleb set down his pen and looked at her directly. Evie, I need you to understand something. Nothing you did was foolish or wrong. Langford is a professional predator. He's been doing this for at least a decade that we know of, probably longer. He's refined his techniques to the point where even smart, careful women get caught in his web. You're not to blame for this. But I should have seen the signs, Evelyn protested. The vagueness about his location, the excuses about why we couldn't meet in person, the request for money, all perfectly reasonable when framed the way he framed them, Caleb interrupted. That's his genius, if you can call it that. He makes the unreasonable seem reasonable. He gives you just enough detail to satisfy your concerns while keeping himself untraceable. And he uses your own virtues, your kindness, your willingness to trust, your desire to build something meaningful, against you. Evelyn wanted to believe him, but the weight of her mistakes still pressed heavy on her chest. What happens now? You have all this information. Does it help you find him? Caleb flipped through his notes. It confirms patterns I've already identified, which is useful. The timeline matches what he's done with other victims, about 18 months of correspondence before escalating to requests for money and invitations west. The intermediary introduction is also typical. He rarely initiates contact directly. So we're no closer to actually catching him? I didn't say that. Caleb stood and went to one of the filing cabinets, pulling out a thick folder. I've been mapping his movements based on where letters were postmarked and where victims were told to meet him. He stays mostly in the mountain territories, Wyoming, Colorado, Montana. He avoids cities where Pinkerton has a strong presence, and he tends to work in cycles. He spread several maps on the desk, marked with dates and locations in different colored ink. Evelyn leaned forward, trying to make sense of the pattern. Each color represents a different victim, Caleb explained. Red is my sister, Caroline. Blue is a woman named Martha Hennessy in Denver. Green is Sarah Wycliffe from St. Louis, and so on. See how they cluster? Evelyn did see. The marks formed rough circles radiating out from certain points, stage stops, small towns, places where someone could receive mail without attracting too much attention. He has bases of operation, she realized, places he returns to between cons. Exactly. And right now, based on the timing of your arrival at Jacobson's stage stop and the pattern of his previous activity, I think he's somewhere in this region. Caleb circled an area of the map that included several small settlements north and west of Cheyenne. How do you know he hasn't already moved on? If he got my money 3 weeks ago, because he's greedy, Caleb said flatly, and patient. He doesn't just run one con at a time. He usually has 3 or 4 women on the hook simultaneously, at different stages of the process. You were probably his most advanced mark, ready to be harvested. But there are others still in the cultivation phase, women he's been writing to for months who aren't ready to send money yet. The calculation in that strategy was chilling. So he's still writing letters somewhere, starting new correspondences while old ones play out? Most likely. He needs a place with regular mail service, but not so much traffic that people pay attention to who's sending and receiving large volumes of correspondence. A small town with a post office and a boarding house where he can maintain a low profile. Evelyn studied the map, her mind working through the logic. If you know the area he operates in, why haven't you caught him yet? Caleb's expression darkened. Because knowing the general area and actually finding him are two different things. He uses false names, pays cash for everything, and never stays in one place long enough to establish patterns that would give him away. And he's smart. He knows Pinkerton is looking for him. He's cautious. But not cautious enough, Evelyn said slowly, an idea forming. He made a mistake with me. He told me to come to Jacobson's stage stop at a specific time. That means he was monitoring that location, waiting to see if I'd actually show up. What if he's still monitoring it? Caleb had gone very still. What are you suggesting? I'm suggesting we use me as bait, Evelyn said, her voice steadier than she felt. We send another letter, supposedly from me to a friend back east. We make sure it's posted from Jacobson's stage stop. In the letter, I mention that I'm staying nearby, that I'm waiting for another stage to take me back to Philadelphia. We make it seem like I'm vulnerable, alone, and, most importantly, still have money left. Absolutely not, Caleb said immediately. That's exactly the kind of dangerous involvement I said I wouldn't allow. You said I'd stay somewhere safe while you did the dangerous parts, Evelyn countered. I can stay somewhere safe, but my letter could draw him out. If he thinks there's a chance to salvage the con to get more money from me, wouldn't he take it? He might, or he might smell a trap and disappear even deeper underground. Or he might decide you're a threat and… Caleb didn't finish the sentence, but he didn't need to. I'm already a threat to him, Evelyn pointed out. I can identify his handwriting, his methods, his patterns. The moment he didn't show up at that stage stop, I became a loose end. Don't you think he's already wondering what happened to me? Whether I went to the authorities? Caleb ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of frustration. This is why I didn't want you involved in the investigation. You're too close to it, too willing to take risks because you're angry and hurt. You're damn right I'm angry, Evelyn shot back, surprising herself with the vehemence in her voice. That man stole my money, my dignity, and my future. He did worse to your sister and God knows how many other women. So yes, I want to take risks if it means stopping him. Don't you? The silence that followed was charged with tension. Caleb stared at her, and Evelyn held his gaze, refusing to back down. Finally, he sighed. If, and this is a very big if, we were to consider your idea, it would have to be done carefully. Langford is smart. He'll be looking for signs of a trap. So we make it believable, Evelyn said, pressing her advantage. I write to a fictional friend. Maybe use Mrs. Bradshaw's name, since he already knows I corresponded with her. I tell her what happened, that I'm devastated, but trying to figure out my next steps. I mentioned staying at the stage stop because it's cheap, and I'm trying to conserve what money I have left. We make it seem real. And then what? We wait for him to show up and try to continue the con? You wait, Evelyn corrected. I'll be somewhere else entirely, somewhere safe like you insisted. But you'll be watching Jacobson's stage stop. If Langford takes the bait, you catch him. Caleb was quiet for a long time, thinking it through. Evelyn could see him weighing risks and benefits, his training as an agent warring with his instinct to protect her from further harm. I need to think about this, he finally said, and I need to consult with my superiors at Pinkerton. This isn't a decision I can make alone. It wasn't the yes Evelyn wanted, but it wasn't a no either. How long will that take? A few days. I'll send a telegram tomorrow, explain the situation. In the meantime, you focus on the ranch work. Try to… He paused, searching for words. Try to let yourself have a normal day or two. You've been through hell, Evie. You don't have to immediately throw yourself into more danger. But the truth was, Evelyn wanted the danger. She wanted the action, the purpose, the chance to turn her victimhood into agency. Sitting quietly and healing felt like admitting defeat, like letting Langford win. Still, she nodded. All right, a few days. But Caleb? I'm not going to change my mind about this. I'm going to help you catch him, one way or another. I know, he said softly. That's what worries me. The next few days fell into a rhythm that was almost comfortable. Evelyn threw herself into organizing the ranch accounts with single-minded intensity, working from dawn until well past dark. The ledgers were a disaster, but they were a disaster with rules and logic. She could impose order here, solve problems through careful attention and methodical work. Sam and Tommy grew accustomed to her presence, treating her with a respect that had nothing to do with her gender and everything to do with her obvious competence. She caught Tommy staring at her more than once. He was young, and she supposed she was the first unmarried woman close to his age he'd spent much time around. But he was always polite, never presumptuous. Caleb came and went, handling ranch work during the day and spending evenings poring over his investigation files. He'd sent his telegram to Pinkerton, and they were waiting for a response. In the meantime, they'd fallen into an easy companionship, sharing meals and occasionally discussing the case, though Caleb was careful not to reveal too many details about his other investigations. On the third evening, after dinner, Caleb asked Evelyn to take a walk with him. They headed up a rise behind the ranch house, climbing until they reached a spot where the entire valley spread out below them. The sun was setting, painting everything in shades of gold and crimson. "My sister loved sunsets," Caleb said quietly. "Used to say they were proof that endings could be beautiful." Evelyn didn't know what to say to that, so she stayed silent, letting him work through whatever thoughts were troubling him. "I got the response from Pinkerton today," he continued. "They approved your plan, with modifications." Evelyn's heart leaped. "What kind of modifications?" "You write the letter exactly as you suggested. We post it from Jacobson's stage stop, make it look legitimate. But instead of you staying away entirely, you'll be at the stage stop for 1 day, visible, real, confirming the story in the letter. Then you'll leave with me, and we'll set up surveillance from a distance." "That's more exposure than you wanted," Evelyn observed. "It's necessary to make the bait convincing. Langford might have sources in that area, people who report on unusual activity. If someone mentions seeing you there, talking about heading back east, it confirms the letter isn't a fabrication." Caleb turned to face her fully. "But Evie, the moment anything feels wrong, the moment I think he's there, you're gone. No arguments, no hesitation. Agreed?" "Agreed," Evelyn said, though a part of her rebelled at the idea of running while Caleb faced the danger alone. "We'll leave in 2 days. That gives you time to write a convincing letter and gives me time to make arrangements for surveillance. Sam and Tommy can handle the ranch while we're gone." "How long do you think we'll have to wait?" Caleb shrugged. "Could be days, could be weeks, assuming he takes the bait at all. This is a long shot, Evie, you understand that, right? The odds of this working are probably less than 50-50. "But they're better odds than we had before," Evelyn pointed out. "True enough." Caleb was quiet for a moment, watching the sun sink below the mountains. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Why is this so important to you? I understand wanting justice, wanting closure. But you're willing to risk a lot for this. There are easier ways to rebuild your life." Evelyn considered the question carefully. "Do you know what the worst part was? Not the lost money, not even the humiliation. It was the loss of trust, in others, but also in myself. I thought I was smart enough not to be fooled. I thought I was careful, prudent, sensible. And then I did something catastrophically stupid based on nothing but pretty words on paper." She took a breath, steadying herself. "If I just walk away, let someone else deal with Langford, then that loss of trust becomes permanent. I'll spend the rest of my life second-guessing every decision, wondering if I'm about to make another terrible mistake. But if I face this, if I help catch him, then maybe I can prove to myself that I'm not just a victim, that I'm someone who fights back." Caleb nodded slowly. "That makes sense. But Evie, you don't have anything to prove. Not to me, not to anyone. You're already stronger than you think." The words wrapped around something broken inside her, not quite healing it, but at least acknowledging the wound. "Thank you," she whispered. They stood together in the gathering darkness, two damaged people finding unexpected kinship and shared purpose. And for the first time since this whole nightmare began, Evelyn felt something shift inside her. Not hope exactly, but something close to it. The possibility that maybe, just maybe, she could emerge from this disaster as someone stronger than who she'd been before. 2 days later, they rode back to Jacobson's stage stop. The journey back to Jacobson's stage stop felt entirely different from Evelyn's first arrival. Then, she'd been full of nervous anticipation, her heart caught between hope and anxiety about meeting the man she believed she'd marry. Now, riding beside Caleb through the same landscape, she carried a different kind of tension, the sharp awareness of someone walking knowingly into danger. The letter she'd written was tucked carefully in her saddlebag, composed over 2 evenings of painstaking effort to strike exactly the right tone. She'd read it aloud to Caleb 3 times, refining phrases until they captured the perfect mixture of devastation, confusion, and residual vulnerability. It was addressed to Helen Bradshaw, though of course it would never actually reach that woman. The point was for Langford, or whoever might be watching for his interests, to intercept it, to believe it was genuine correspondence from a woman still reeling from betrayal. "You're quiet," Caleb observed as they crested a familiar rise. The stage stop was visible in the distance, that same lonely building where Evelyn's dreams had died what felt like a lifetime ago. "Just thinking," she replied, "about how different everything looks now." "Second thoughts?" Evelyn shook her head. "No, just awareness, I suppose, of how much can change in a week." They'd timed their arrival for late afternoon, when the light was beginning its slow fade toward evening. Caleb wanted Evelyn visible to anyone who might be watching, but not so exposed that she'd be vulnerable after dark. The plan was simple. She'd spend a few hours at the stage stop, making sure Mr. Jacobson and anyone else around saw her, heard her story about waiting for the next stage east. She'd post her letter, take a meal, perhaps sit on that same bench where Caleb had found her. Then, as darkness fell, she'd leave with him, and they'd establish their surveillance position in the hills overlooking the stop. Mr. Jacobson looked surprised to see her when they entered. "Miss Porter, I didn't expect— that is, I thought you'd moved on." "I had," Evelyn said, letting exhaustion color her voice. It wasn't difficult. She was tired, though not for the reasons Jacobson would assume. "I've been staying with a family north of here, working to earn passage money back to Philadelphia. Mr. Mercer was kind enough to escort me back here to wait for the next stage." Jacobson's gaze shifted to Caleb with new understanding. The Pinkerton agent had clearly made an impression during their last visit. "That's decent of you, Mercer. When's the next stage through, Miss Porter?" 4 days, I believe," Evelyn replied, consulting a schedule she'd memorized. "I was hoping I might stay here while I wait. I can pay for room and board this time." Of course," Jacobson said, his manner considerably warmer now that money was involved. "Same room as before?" "That would be fine. Thank you." While Jacobson prepared her room, Evelyn approached the small postal station in the corner of the building. A weathered man with ink-stained fingers looked up from sorting mail. "Help you, miss?" "I need to post a letter," Evelyn said, pulling the envelope from her bag. "To Philadelphia. What's the fastest way?" "Regular post takes about 2 weeks," the clerk said. "You can pay extra for express delivery. Cuts it down to 10 days or so." "Regular post is fine," Evelyn replied, handing over the letter along with the required coins. "I'm not in any hurry now." She watched as he stamped the envelope and added it to a pile of outgoing mail. The trap was set. Now they just had to wait and see if anyone would take the bait. Caleb stayed close, but not too close, maintaining the fiction that he was simply an acquaintance helping her through a difficult situation. He took a room for himself, then disappeared outside to tend to the horses. Evelyn knew he was actually surveying the area, identifying potential surveillance positions and escape routes. The man was nothing if not thorough. As evening approached, Evelyn forced herself to sit on that bench outside the stage stop, the one where she'd spent 3 miserable days waiting for a man who would never come. It felt like pressing on a bruise, deliberately invoking pain to test if the wound had healed. The answer, she discovered, was complicated. Yes, it hurt. But the hurt was different now. Less raw grief and more cold anger. She sat there for perhaps an hour, watching the sunset paint the sky in familiar colors. A few travelers passed through, a family in a wagon, a pair of cowboys heading somewhere with purpose, an old prospector leading a pack mule. None of them paid her much attention, though the cowboys tipped their hats politely. Just another woman waiting at a stage stop, nothing remarkable about that. When full darkness finally fell, Caleb emerged from the building and approached her with studied casualness. To any observer, it would look like a concerned friend checking on someone who'd suffered a disappointment. "Time to go," he said quietly. "You've been visible enough." Evelyn stood, making a show of stretching stiff muscles. "I should tell Mr. Jacobson I'm stepping out for some air." "Already handled. Told him you weren't feeling well, that I'd take you for a short ride to clear your head. He thinks we'll be back in an hour." They collected the horses and rode out slowly, as if in no particular hurry. Only when they were well away from the stage stop did Caleb change direction, leading them into the hills that overlooked the valley. He'd clearly scouted the location earlier. He navigated through the darkness with confidence, finally stopping at a sheltered position that offered a clear view of the stage stop below while keeping them hidden from observation. "We'll take shifts," Caleb said as he helped Evelyn dismount. 2 hours on watch, 2 hours rest. I'll take the first watch." He'd brought supplies for an extended stay: bedrolls, food, water, and a spyglass for watching the stage stop. The camp he set up was efficient and minimal, designed to leave no obvious trace of their presence. Evelyn wrapped herself in her bedroll but found sleep impossible. The night air was cold, carrying the sharp clarity that came with high altitude, and every sound seemed magnified in the darkness. She could hear Caleb moving quietly nearby, the soft sounds of him settling into position to watch the stage stop. After perhaps half an hour of pretending to rest, she gave up and joined him. "Can't sleep." "Figured you might not be able to," Caleb said without turning from his surveillance position. "First time doing something like this? Is it that obvious?" "You're doing fine, but yes, the adrenaline makes rest difficult." He handed her the spyglass. "Want to take a look?" Through the lens, the stage stop appeared much closer, details visible despite the distance and darkness. Lamplight glowed in a few windows. She could see Jacobson moving around inside, probably preparing to close up for the night. "What exactly are we watching for?" Evelyn asked. "Anything unusual. Someone arriving after dark and asking questions about you, mail being tampered with, signs of surveillance from other positions. Langford is cautious. If he takes the bait, he won't rush in blindly. He'll watch, gather information, make sure it's not a trap before he makes any move. And if he determines it is a trap, then he disappears, and we're back to square one," Caleb said frankly. "But at least we tried." They settled into a companionable silence, passing the spyglass back and forth every few minutes. The stars overhead were brilliant, undimmed by any city lights, and Evelyn found herself thinking about Caroline Mercer. Had she seen stars like this during her doomed journey west? Had she felt this same mixture of hope and fear, not knowing she was walking into disaster? "Tell me about her," Evelyn said quietly. "Your sister. What was she like?" Caleb was still for so long that Evelyn thought he wouldn't answer. Then softly, he began to speak. "She was brilliant, not just smart, brilliant. Could read a book once and quote passages back to you weeks later. She learned French from a neighbor woman just because she thought it sounded beautiful. When our parents died, she was devastated, but she didn't fall apart. She took charge of practical things, helped me figure out what needed to be done. She was stronger than anyone gave her credit for." His voice carried the weight of old grief, worn smooth by time but never truly diminishing. "She wanted to be a teacher," he continued. "Maybe eventually open a school for girls, give them the kind of education she'd never had access to in Kansas. She talked about it all the time, how women deserved the same opportunities as men, how education was the key to independence. She would have been magnificent at it." "She sounds remarkable," Evelyn said. "She was. And Langford took all of that, all that potential, all those dreams, and turned them into tools to destroy her. He read her perfectly, understood exactly what she wanted, and used it against her." "Is that why you became a Pinkerton agent? To find him?" "Partly. Also because I needed to do something that mattered, something that might prevent other families from experiencing what we went through. The agency does good work when it's not being used by rich men to break strikes. Tracking con artists, recovering stolen property, finding missing people. That's work I can believe in." Evelyn thought about that. How tragedy could be transformed into purpose. How grief could be channeled into action. It was what she was trying to do herself, wasn't it? taking her own pain and using it to fuel something constructive. Do you think she'd be proud of you? Eveline asked. Caroline, I mean, for what you're doing. Caleb considered the question. I think she'd understand it. Whether she'd be proud or worried, I honestly don't know. Caroline believed in justice, but she also believed in moving forward, not letting the past consume you. I'm not sure I've managed that second part very well. You built a ranch. You have people who depend on you, who respect you. That's moving forward. Is it? Or is it just another form of waiting, keeping myself busy while I hunt the man who killed my sister? The question hung between them, unanswerable. Before Eveline could attempt a response, Caleb suddenly tensed. Movement, he said quietly, raising the spyglass. Someone's approaching the stage stop, on foot, from the west. Eveline's heart rate spiked. Can you see who it is? Not clearly. They're staying in the shadows, moving carefully. Whoever it is doesn't want to be seen. They watched in tense silence as the figure approached the stage stop, paused near the entrance, then seemed to circle around to the side of the building where the postal station was located. The person was there for perhaps 5 minutes before retreating back into the darkness, disappearing in the direction they'd come from. Could you see anything? Eveline asked urgently. Was it him? Was it Langford? I don't know, Caleb admitted, frustration evident in his voice. They were too far away, too careful about staying out of the light. Could have been Langford, could have been someone checking mail for him, could have been completely unrelated to our operation. But the timing is suspicious, I agree, but not conclusive. Caleb lowered the spyglass and turned to look at her. This is the hard part of surveillance work. Waiting, watching, never being quite certain if what you're seeing matters, or if it's just coincidence. So what do? We keep watching. If that was Langford or his agent, they got a look at the outgoing mail. They know your letter exists, heading back east. The question is what they do with that information. The rest of the night passed slowly, marked by the gradual rotation of stars overhead. Caleb eventually insisted Eveline try to sleep, taking the watch himself. She managed a few restless hours, waking to find him still alert, still watching, his profile sharp against the pre-dawn gray. Anything else? She asked, sitting up and rubbing sleep from her eyes. Nothing significant. A couple of travelers passed through around midnight. Jacobson closed up around 10 and hasn't emerged since. If Langford is out there, he's being patient. They maintained their surveillance through the next day, taking turns watching the stage stop and catching brief periods of rest. It was tedious work, requiring more patience than Eveline had realized. Nothing happened, or rather, the normal things happened. Travelers came and went. Jacobson went about his business. The mail coach arrived in the afternoon, dropped off a few passengers and packages, and departed. Your letter is gone, Caleb noted, tracking the mail coach as it disappeared into the distance. On its way to Philadelphia, where it will eventually reach a dead letter office since Helen Bradshaw doesn't actually live at the address you used. Unless Langford intercepts it somewhere along the route, Eveline said. That would require him to have Confederates positioned along the mail route, which is possible but complicated. More likely, if he's interested, he already learned what he needed to know from seeing the envelope and perhaps bribing a postal clerk to tell him about the woman who sent it. As the second day of surveillance wore on, Eveline found herself growing restless. The inactivity was harder than she'd anticipated, the constant state of alert vigilance exhausting in its own way. She understood now why Caleb had warned her that this could take days or weeks. The waiting was its own form of torture. Tell me about the other women, she said during one of their shared watches. The ones Langford victimized. You said you've tracked 15 confirmed cases? Caleb hesitated, then seemed to decide that sharing the information might help pass the time. 15 that I know of. There are probably more. Women who never reported what happened, either because they were too ashamed or because they didn't realize they'd been conned until it was too late to do anything about it. What happened to them after Langford disappeared? Different things. Some, like you, had family or resources to fall back on. They recovered, rebuilt their lives, though I imagine the emotional scars lasted. Others weren't so lucky. Martha Hennessy, the woman I mentioned before from Denver, lost her entire savings and ended up working in a laundry just to survive. She was a school teacher before Langford, educated, independent, respected. After he was done with her, she could barely afford to eat. Evelyn felt the familiar anger rising in her chest. Did she press charges? Tried to, but Langford was already gone, and without evidence of his real identity or location, the authorities couldn't do much. That's part of why he's gotten away with this for so long. By the time his victims realize what's happened, he's already become someone else. Somewhere else. It's like chasing smoke. What about the woman who died by her own hand? You mentioned her before but didn't give details. Caleb's expression darkened. Her name was Elizabeth Chen. She was from San Francisco, daughter of Chinese immigrants who'd built a successful import business. She was educated at a convent school, spoke 4 languages, and had prospects most women would envy. Langford presented himself as a mining engineer with claims in Nevada. He courted her for 2 years, longer than his usual pattern, and convinced her to not only give him money, but to break with her family, who disapproved of her marrying outside their community. He paused, and Evelyn could see the muscles in his jaw working. When he disappeared with her money, Elizabeth was left with nothing. Her family disowned her for the shame she'd brought them. She couldn't return to San Francisco, couldn't face the life she'd given up. 3 months later, she walked into the Nevada desert and never came back. They found her body 2 weeks after that. Jesus, Evelyn whispered. The thing is, Caleb continued, his voice hard, Langford had to have known what he was doing to her. He knew her family situation, knew the cultural pressures she faced, knew exactly how devastating his betrayal would be. And he did it anyway, because to him, she was just another mark, another source of money. The human cost never factored into his calculations. They fell silent after that, both lost in dark thoughts. Evelyn understood now, in a way she hadn't quite grasped before, why Caleb had dedicated years of his life to hunting this man. It wasn't just about his sister, though that was certainly the catalyst. It was about all of them, all the women whose lives had been damaged or destroyed by a man who saw them as nothing more than profitable opportunities. The 3rd day of surveillance brought a change. Around mid-morning, a well-dressed man arrived at the stage stop on horseback. Even from their distant vantage point, it was clear he wasn't a typical traveler. His clothes were too fine, his horse too expensive. He carried himself with the confidence of someone accustomed to moving through the world without obstacles. That's interesting, Caleb murmured, training the spyglass on the newcomer. He's asking Jacobson questions. Lots of gesturing, pointing around. Now, Jacobson's shaking his head, looking confused. Can you see his face? Evelyn asked, trying to keep the urgency out of her voice. Not clearly enough for a positive identification. He's wearing a hat pulled low and the angle's wrong. But his build is right. Matches the description I have of Langford from witnesses who actually saw him in person. Mid-30s, about 6 feet tall, lean build, moves with easy confidence. They watched as the man spent perhaps 20 minutes at the stage stop, talking with Jacobson and occasionally glancing around as if assessing the area. Then, abruptly, he mounted his horse and rode off in the direction he'd come from, west, toward a cluster of small settlements. That was him, Evelyn said with certainty she couldn't quite explain. I know it was. Maybe, Caleb said cautiously, but we can't be sure, and even if it was, we don't know where he went. There are a dozen places he could be hiding in that direction. So we follow him. We can't. By the time we break camp and get down there, he'll be long gone, and if he is Langford, he'll be watching for pursuit. If we tip our hand too early, he'll disappear. Evelyn wanted to scream with frustration. They were so close. She could feel it. But Caleb was right. Rushing in without a plan would only spoil everything they'd worked for. What do we do then? She asked, forcing herself to speak calmly. We wait a little longer, see if he comes back. If that was Langford, and if he believed your letter was genuine, he'll need to develop a plan for approaching you. He's not going to just walk up and reintroduce himself. He'll need a new angle, a new story. That takes time. They maintained their watch through the rest of the day and into the evening. The well-dressed stranger didn't return, but Evelyn noticed something else. Around sunset, a different man appeared, younger and less refined than the first. He didn't enter the stage stop, just loitered nearby for a while, smoking a cigarette and apparently watching the building. Look out, Caleb said, identifying the man's purpose immediately. Someone's keeping an eye on the place. The question is whether it's related to our operation or something else entirely. Could Langford have hired someone to watch for him? Possible. He's used accomplices before, though usually for more active roles. Having someone simply observe and report is more sophisticated than his typical methods, but he's had years to refine his approach. The young man eventually left, disappearing into the gathering darkness. Caleb made careful notes about his appearance, height, weight, distinguishing features, the direction he'd gone. Everything might be relevant later, or none of it might matter. That was the uncertainty they lived with. On the fourth day, Evelyn was starting to think the entire plan had been a failure when things finally shifted. It was early afternoon, the sun beating down with autumn warmth, when a woman arrived at the stage stop in a small buggy. She was well dressed, clearly not a typical frontier traveler, and she carried herself with purpose. Caleb tensed immediately. That's new. Through the spyglass, they watched as the woman entered the stage stop and emerged a short time later with Jacobson. The two of them stood outside, the woman gesturing animatedly, Jacobson shaking his head and looking bewildered. Finally, the woman pressed what looked like money into Jacobson's hand, and his demeanor changed. He nodded, disappeared inside, and returned with what appeared to be a letter. "She's asking about you," Caleb said, his voice tight with controlled excitement. "She just bought information from Jacobson. Now she's reading something, probably your letter to Bradshaw. Jacobson must have kept it, or made a copy before sending the original." "Can a postal clerk do that? Isn't that illegal?" "Extremely illegal. But Jacobson isn't technically a postal clerk. He just handles mail as part of running the stage stop. And if someone offers him enough money, apparently his scruples are negotiable." They watched as the woman read the letter, nodded with satisfaction, and handed it back to Jacobson. She spoke to him for a few more minutes, then returned to her buggy and drove off, heading west, in the same direction the well-dressed man had gone. "What just happened?" Evelyn asked, trying to make sense of what they'd witnessed. "If I had to guess, that was Langford's way of confirming the letter was legitimate. He sent a woman, maybe a wife or partner, maybe just someone he hired, to verify the story. Women attract less suspicion, especially in situations like this. Jacobson would be more likely to talk to a sympathetic woman asking about another woman in distress than he would to a man asking questions. So now Langford knows I'm supposedly waiting here, alone and vulnerable, with at least some money left. Exactly, which means the next move is his. He'll develop an approach. Some new identity, some new story to explain why Thomas Langford never showed up. But this other man is here to help you." Caleb lowered the spyglass and looked at Evelyn. "This is where it gets dangerous. If he comes back, he'll be looking for you. And when he doesn't find you at the stage stop, he's going to start asking harder questions." "So we need to give him a target he can find," Evelyn said, understanding dawning. "We need me to actually be at the stage stop when he comes looking." "Absolutely not," Caleb said flatly. "That wasn't part of the plan. The plan was to draw him out, and it's working. But if he arrives and I'm not there, he'll know something is wrong. We'll lose him. We'll find another way." "There isn't another way," Evelyn interrupted, surprised by her own vehemence. "You said yourself he's cautious, careful, smart. If anything seems off, he'll disappear. The only way this works is if I'm there, if everything appears exactly as the letter suggested. Me, alone, waiting for a stage, vulnerable and desperate." "With me hidden nearby," Caleb countered. "The moment he approaches you, I move in. But Evie, you need to understand what you're agreeing to. Langford is dangerous. We don't know how he'll react when confronted. We don't know if he's armed, if he has backup, if he'll try to take you hostage or worse." "I understand the risks," Evelyn said, though her hands were trembling slightly. "And I'm still willing to take them. This man destroyed my life, Caleb. He destroyed your sister's life. How many more women are we going to let him hurt because we're too cautious to take necessary risks?" They stared at each other, wills clashing in the afternoon heat. Finally, Caleb looked away. "You're as stubborn as Caroline was," he muttered. "All right, but we do this smart. We set up properly, we have escape routes planned, and at the first sign of real danger, you run. Not negotiate, not try to help me, just run. Can you promise me that?" "I promise," Evelyn said, and meant it. She wanted justice, but she wasn't suicidal. They spent the next several hours planning in meticulous detail. Caleb would position himself inside the stage stop, hidden but close enough to intervene immediately if needed. Evelyn would be outside, visible, playing the role of a woman waiting for transportation. They developed signals. If she touched her left ear, it meant she felt threatened and wanted Caleb to intervene immediately. If she stood and walked toward the building, it meant she was trying to draw Langford inside where Caleb would have a better tactical advantage. As the sun began its descent toward evening, they made their move. Caleb rode down openly, leaving Evelyn to follow on foot after a short interval, the fiction being that they'd had a falling out, that she'd insisted on managing alone from here. He spoke with Jacobson, explaining that Miss Porter would be returning shortly, that she'd decided to wait for the stage after all. Jacobson seemed unsurprised, probably assuming Evelyn had simply been staying elsewhere and was now ready to move on. Caleb paid for another night's lodging, then made a show of riding off, heading east as if returning to his ranch. In reality, he circled back on foot, entering the stage stop through a rear entrance and concealing himself in a storage room that offered a clear view of the main area. Evelyn waited until full darkness before approaching the stage stop herself, carrying her small bag and looking appropriately weary. Jacobson greeted her with professional courtesy, showed her to her room, and informed her that the stage would indeed arrive in the morning as scheduled. "Will you be wanting dinner, Miss Porter?" he asked. "Just something light, please. I'm not very hungry." She forced herself to eat the bread and cheese Jacobson brought, knowing she needed her strength for whatever was coming. Then, as the evening deepened, she went outside and sat on that familiar bench, wrapped in her cloak against the cold, and waited. The stars emerged, brilliant and indifferent. Somewhere in the darkness, Caleb was watching, ready to act. Somewhere else, possibly, Thomas Langford was planning his approach, preparing to spin new lies to a woman he believed was still under his power. Evelyn touched the small knife Caleb had insisted she carry in her pocket, a last resort, something to defend herself with if everything went wrong. She hoped desperately she wouldn't need it, but she also knew, with a clarity that came from hard experience, that hope was not a strategy. So she sat and she waited, and she prepared herself for the confrontation that was coming. Not with the naive optimism of the woman who'd first arrived at this stage stop weeks ago, but with the harder wisdom of someone who'd learned that trust had to be earned, that pretty words could hide ugly intentions, and that sometimes the only way through fear was straight into its heart. The night grew colder. Evelyn pulled her cloak tighter and kept her vigil, knowing that somewhere out in that vast darkness, a predator was circling, and that soon, very soon, he would make his move. He came with the dawn. Evelyn had dozed fitfully through the night, jerking awake at every sound, her hand instinctively moving to the knife in her pocket. But it wasn't until the sky began its slow shift from black to gray that she heard the distinctive sound of a horse approaching at an easy walk, unhurried and confident. She was back on the bench, had positioned herself there deliberately as soon as she'd heard the hoofbeats, wanting to appear natural, vulnerable, unguarded. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but she kept her breathing steady, her posture that of a woman resigned to waiting, not one braced for confrontation. The rider resolved out of the early morning mist like something from a dream, or perhaps a nightmare. He was exactly as Caleb had described from their surveillance, well-dressed in clothes too fine for frontier travel, sitting his horse with practiced ease, handsome in a way that was almost theatrical. His face was clean-shaven, his hair carefully groomed beneath an expensive hat, and when he smiled at her, his teeth were white and even, nothing like the photograph he'd sent her, nothing like Thomas Langford was supposed to be. "Excuse me, miss," he said, his voice cultured and warm, carrying just a hint of concern. "I hope I'm not disturbing you. Are you waiting for the morning stage?" Evelyn made herself look up slowly, as if startled from deep thought. Yes, I am." He dismounted with fluid grace, looping his reins over the hitching post. Up close, he was even more polished than he'd appeared from a distance. Everything about him spoke of education, breeding, refinement. He was exactly the kind of man who could write those beautiful letters, who could quote Wordsworth and discuss philosophy with apparent depth. "Forgive me for saying so," he continued, his eyes kind and sympathetic, "but you look as though you've had a difficult time. Is everything all right?" It was a simple opening, the kind of concerned inquiry any gentleman might make to a woman who appeared distressed. But Evelyn heard the calculation beneath it, the careful probe for information. He was testing her, seeing if she was the woman he'd been told about. "I've had better weeks," she admitted, allowing weariness to show in her voice. "I'm afraid I'm in rather an embarrassing situation." "I'm terribly sorry to hear that." He took a step closer, not threatening, just solicitous. "My name is James Blackwood. I own a ranch about 20 miles west of here. I was passing through on business and thought I'd stop for breakfast. But if there's any way I might be of assistance..." James Blackwood. A new name, a new identity, but the same predator beneath the polished exterior. Evelyn felt a cold clarity settle over her, sharpening her senses. This was him. This was Thomas Langford, or whatever his real name was. The man who'd destroyed Caroline Mercer and Elizabeth Chen and Martha Hennessy and all the others. The man who'd taken her money and her trust and left her with nothing but ashes. "That's kind of you, Mr. Blackwood," she said carefully, "but I'm afraid my troubles are of the sort that can't easily be resolved. I'm simply waiting to return to Philadelphia." "Philadelphia? That's quite a journey." He settled onto the bench beside her, not too close but near enough to establish a connection. "Forgive my presumption, but you seem like an educated woman, someone from a good family. What brings you all the way out here, and in such obvious distress?" The question was perfectly pitched, sympathetic without being intrusive, inviting confidence without demanding it. Evelyn could see how women fell for this approach. He made you want to tell him things, to unburden yourself to this understanding stranger who seemed to genuinely care. "I came west to meet someone," Evelyn heard herself say, falling into the role she'd prepared. "A gentleman I'd been corresponding with. We were to be married." Langford's expression shifted to one of dawning understanding and appropriate dismay. "Oh no, please don't tell me he never appeared," Evelyn confirmed, letting her voice break slightly. "I waited for 3 days. I sent telegrams, made inquiries. It was as if he never existed. I finally had to accept that I'd been deceived." "My dear lady, that's absolutely reprehensible." Langford's indignation appeared genuine, his voice hardening with what seemed like righteous anger. "What kind of scoundrel would do such a thing? Did you involve the authorities?" "What could they do? I don't even know his real name, apparently. The address he gave me was false. Everything was false." Evelyn touched her handkerchief to her eyes, not actually crying, but creating the impression of barely controlled emotion. "I've been staying with a family nearby, working to earn enough money for passage home. I just want to leave this terrible place and try to forget this ever happened." She watched Langford absorb this information, saw the subtle calculation behind his sympathetic expression. He was evaluating her story, testing it against what he already knew, deciding whether she was genuinely the mark he'd set up or something more dangerous. "That's absolutely dreadful," he said finally. "You must feel so betrayed, so alone out here. Do you have family back in Philadelphia? People who'll help you get back on your feet?" The question was key. He wanted to know if she had resources, if she was worth pursuing further, or if she was truly tapped out. Evelyn had prepared for this. "Some distant cousins," she said. "We're not close, but they'll take me in until I can find proper employment. I have a little money saved still, enough to survive until I can rebuild my life. It's not what I had before, but it's something." The mention of remaining money was bait, and she saw the flicker of interest in Langford's eyes. Not greed exactly, he was too controlled for that, but calculation. A woman with some resources left, emotionally vulnerable, desperate to trust someone after being betrayed. Perfect prey. "Miss..." He paused delicately. "I'm sorry, I didn't catch your name." "Porter. Evelyn Porter." "Miss Porter." He said her name as if tasting it, committing it to memory. "I understand if you're reluctant to trust anyone after what you've been through, but please allow me to at least buy you breakfast. You shouldn't have to face the morning alone, not after such an ordeal." It was smoothly done, offering kindness without strings, positioning himself as a gentleman concerned only with her welfare. Evelyn knew this was the moment. Accept his offer. Let him draw her further into conversation. Give him time to weave his new deception. Inside the stage stop, hidden in that storage room, Caleb would be listening to every word. She'd positioned herself deliberately so their voices would carry through the open window. He would know Langford had arrived, would be ready to move the moment she gave the signal. "I suppose breakfast would be nice," Evelyn said, standing slowly. "Mr. Jacobson makes decent biscuits, at least." Langford stood as well, offering his arm with old-fashioned courtesy. Excellent. And perhaps, if you'll permit me, I can tell you a bit about this country. I know it seems harsh and unforgiving after what you've experienced, but there's beauty here too, for those who have eyes to see it. They moved toward the stage stop entrance, Eveline acutely aware of every step, every breath. Langford was still talking, his voice warm and engaging, spinning a story about his ranch and his life out west. He was good at this, the pacing, the details that seemed specific enough to be believable without being so concrete they could be verified. She understood now how he'd fooled so many women. The letters had been impressive, but in person, with the force of his personality and practiced charm, he was nearly irresistible. Nearly. Jacobson looked up as they entered, his expression curious but not alarmed. To him, this was simply a gentleman being kind to a lady in distress. Nothing unusual about that. "Morning, Jacobson," Langford said easily. "Could we get breakfast for two? And coffee? Plenty of coffee." "Sure thing, Mr. Blackwood." Jacobson nodded to Eveline. "Miss Porter, glad to see you're not sitting out in the cold this morning." They settled at one of the rough tables, and Langford continued his performance. He asked questions that seemed genuinely interested in her as a person. What she'd done in Philadelphia, what her interests were, how she'd occupied her time. He never pressed too hard, never made her uncomfortable, but slowly, skillfully, he was building a connection. And all the while, Eveline was watching him, studying him, seeing past the performance to the predator beneath. She noticed how his eyes occasionally flicked to her reticule, assessing, how he carefully positioned himself between her and the door, not obviously, but enough to control her movements, how every gesture, every word, was calibrated to elicit a specific response. "You mentioned you were traveling on business," Eveline said, when Jacobson brought their breakfast. "What sort of business, if you don't mind my asking?" "Cattle, mostly," Langford replied smoothly. "I'm meeting with buyers in Cheyenne tomorrow, negotiating contracts for the spring. It's tedious work but necessary. A ranch doesn't run itself, unfortunately." "You run it alone?" "I have good men working for me, but yes, ultimately the responsibility falls to me. It's lonely sometimes, I'll admit. The frontier isn't kind to those who crave intellectual companionship. Most of the men out here are more comfortable with a whiskey bottle than a conversation about literature or philosophy." He was setting up the next phase, Eveline realized. The lonely rancher, successful but isolated, longing for someone who could understand him. It was probably the same approach he'd used with Caroline Mercer, with all the others. The story varied in details, but the emotional manipulation remained constant. "That must be difficult," she said neutrally. "It is. Though I try to make regular trips back east, maintain connections with civilization." He smiled self-deprecatingly. "I know that sounds pretentious, calling the East civilization as if we're all barbarians out here, but you understand what I mean, I think. The theaters, the libraries, the conversation with educated people, I miss that sometimes." Eveline took a sip of her coffee, using the moment to steady herself. She needed to move this forward, needed to give Caleb an opportunity to act, but she also needed to make sure they had enough evidence of Langford's intentions to make charges stick. "Mr. Blackwood," she said carefully, "why are you being so kind to me? We're strangers. You have no obligation to a woman you just met." Langford met her eyes, and for just a moment she saw something genuine flash there. Not kindness exactly, but a kind of respect. He recognized she was being cautious, testing him, and he approved. It made her seem smarter, more of a challenge, which probably made her more interesting prey. "Honestly," he said, "because I've seen what happens to people out here when they face difficulties alone. The frontier can be brutal, Miss Porter. It breaks people who don't have support, who don't have someone to lean on when times are hard. I wouldn't be able to live with myself if I simply rode away and left you to struggle alone, not when I have the means to help." "Help how?" The question was direct, perhaps too direct, but Eveline needed to know his angle. "Well," Langford said thoughtfully, "I'm not suggesting anything improper, of course, but if you needed a place to stay for a few days, somewhere safe while you make arrangements for your journey home, my ranch has a guest room. My housekeeper is a very respectable woman who could serve as a chaperone. It would give you time to rest, recover your strength, perhaps earn a bit of extra money helping with books or correspondence if you're inclined. No obligation, no expectations beyond honest work for honest pay. There it was, the offer that seemed generous and practical, but would place her isolated and vulnerable on his property, miles from anyone who might help. She'd be dependent on him for food, shelter, transportation. Any money she had would become accessible to him through a dozen subtle manipulations. And if she refused his advances or caught on to his true nature, she'd be too far from civilization to easily escape or get help. Caroline Mercer had probably received a similar offer. Elizabeth Chen certainly had. How many others had walked into this same trap, seeing only kindness where there was actually cold calculation? That's very generous, Evelyn said slowly, but I wouldn't want to impose, It's not an imposition, Langford insisted. Truly, the house is large and I'm away much of the time anyway. You'd actually be helping me out. Like I said, I'm terrible with correspondence and bookkeeping. I could genuinely use someone with your skills. He was pushing now, sensing that he had her off balance. The offer was too good, which should have been a warning sign, but he was framing it as mutual benefit rather than charity. Evelyn could see how effective this approach must be. Women who were proud, who didn't want to accept handouts, could tell themselves they were earning their keep. She glanced toward the back of the room, where she knew Caleb was hidden. They had enough now, didn't they? Langford had established his new identity, made his play for her trust, offered the trap that would isolate her. But some instinct made her hesitate, made her want to push just a little further. "Mr. Blackwood," she said quietly, "have we met before?" Langford's expression didn't change, but Evelyn sensed the sudden spike of tension in him. "I don't believe so. I'm certain I would remember. It's just, you remind me of someone. The way you speak, certain phrases you use. It's probably nothing, just my mind playing tricks after everything that's happened." She was testing him, seeing how he'd react to the suggestion that she might recognize him. A truly innocent man would be puzzled, but unbothered. Langford's reaction was more controlled, more guarded. "We all have common mannerisms," he said smoothly, "especially those of us with similar educational backgrounds. But no, Miss Porter, I'm quite certain we haven't met. I would definitely remember a woman as remarkable as yourself." The compliment was reflexive, an automatic redirection away from dangerous territory. And in that moment, Evelyn realized something that made her blood run cold. Langford wasn't working alone this time. The woman who'd come to verify her letter, the young man who'd been watching the stage stop, they were part of his operation, which meant there might be others nearby, backup in case something went wrong. She needed to signal Caleb, needed to move this to a conclusion before Langford's confederates arrived. But before she could act, the decision was taken out of her hands. The door to the stage stop opened, and the woman from the buggy walked in. She was dressed differently now, more practically like someone who belonged in frontier country, but Evelyn recognized her immediately. The woman's eyes swept the room, took in the scene of Langford sitting with Evelyn, and something flickered across her face. Surprise? Concern? It was gone too quickly to identify. "James," the woman said, her voice carrying a note of familiarity that sent warning bells clanging in Evelyn's mind. "I've been looking for you. We need to leave soon if we're going to make Cheyenne by tomorrow." Langford's expression remained pleasant, but Evelyn saw the tightness around his eyes. This wasn't part of his plan. The woman's arrival was unexpected, possibly unwelcome. "Catherine," he said smoothly, standing to greet her. "I wasn't expecting you until later. Miss Porter, this is Catherine Wells, my business associate. Catherine, this is Miss Evelyn Porter. She's had some difficulties and I was just offering assistance." Catherine's gaze shifted to Evelyn, assessing her with an intensity that was almost physical. "How charitable of you," she said, but there was something brittle in her tone. "Miss Porter, you should know that James has a reputation for helping damsels in distress. It's quite admirable, really." The words were superficially supportive, but the subtext was clear. This woman was warning her off, marking territory. Evelyn's mind raced. Was Catherine a confederate in Langford's schemes, or was she another victim, one who'd fallen for his lies and now worked with him either willingly or through some form of coercion? "I appreciate Mr. Blackwood's kindness," Evelyn said carefully. "Though I haven't accepted his offer of employment yet, I was just explaining that I need to think about it." "Very wise," Catherine said, her smile not reaching her eyes. "It's always good to be cautious with strangers, isn't it? even ones who seemed trustworthy. The tension in the room had shifted, become something more complex than just Langford's predation. There were currents here Evelyn didn't fully understand, relationships and dynamics that weren't immediately obvious. But one thing was clear: Catherine's arrival had disrupted Langford's plan, made him uncertain, and uncertain men made mistakes. "James," Catherine continued, "we really should go. The cattle buyers won't wait forever, and you know how particular Henderson is about punctuality." "Yes, of course," Langford said, but Evelyn could see him calculating, trying to salvage the situation. "Miss Porter, I apologize for leaving so abruptly. If you'd like to consider my offer, I'll be back through this way in 3 days. Perhaps we could continue our conversation then?" He was trying to maintain the connection, keep the possibility open. 3 days would give him time to deal with whatever Catherine represented, to come back with a new approach. Evelyn knew this was the moment. Let him leave, and they might lose him, might never get another chance this good. But if she moved too soon without Caleb's support, she could find herself facing 2 people instead of 1, and the odds would shift dramatically against her. She made her decision. "Actually, Mr. Blackwood," she said, standing and reaching into her reticule, "I don't think we need to wait 3 days. I think we should settle this matter right now." She pulled out the small knife Caleb had given her, not brandishing it as a weapon, but holding it where it could be seen. At the same moment, she touched her left ear with her other hand, the signal they'd agreed upon. Langford's expression shifted instantly, the mask of charm dropping away to reveal cold assessment. "Miss Porter, I'm not sure what you think you're—" The storage room door slammed open, and Caleb emerged with his pistol drawn. "United States Pinkerton Agency," he said, his voice hard and official, and "Thomas Langford, you're under arrest for fraud, theft, and conspiracy to commit fraud." Everything happened very fast after that. Langford's hand moved toward his coat, and Caleb's gun came up to center on his chest. "Don't," Caleb said quietly. "Whatever you're reaching for, it's not worth dying for." Catherine made a sound, not quite a scream, more like a gasp of realization. She stumbled backward, her face going white. "Oh God," she whispered. "Oh God, you're her, aren't you? You're one of them. One of his marks." The confirmation hit Evelyn like a physical blow. Catherine knew. She knew what Langford was, what he did, and she'd been part of it. Jacobson had frozen behind his counter, staring at the scene with wide eyes. "What in the hell is going on here?" "Stay back, Jacobson," Caleb ordered, not taking his eyes off Langford. "This doesn't concern you." "Langford, hands where I can see them. Slowly." Langford complied, but his expression held no fear. Instead, he was watching Caleb with something like recognition. "You're Mercer," he said, "Caroline's brother. I wondered when you'd finally catch up to me." The casual mention of his sister's name made Caleb's hand tighten on his pistol. "You have the right to remain silent," he said, his voice barely controlled. "I'd suggest you use it." "I'm curious," Langford continued as if Caleb hadn't spoken. "How did you find me? I've been so careful. Was it Miss Porter? Did she somehow contact you before coming here?" "Actually," Evelyn said, finding her voice, "he found me. After you abandoned me at this very stage stop. He's been tracking you for years, waiting for you to make a mistake. And you finally did." Something flickered in Langford's eyes. Not quite regret, but perhaps a professional acknowledgement of error. "Clever," he admitted. "Using one of my own victims as bait. I should have anticipated that. But tell me, Mercer, are you prepared to kill me? Right here in front of witnesses? Because that's what it would take. I'm not going to prison. I'd rather die than spend years in a cage." "That can be arranged," Caleb said flatly. "Caleb, no." Evelyn hadn't meant to cry out, but the words came automatically. This wasn't justice. This was execution. No matter what Langford had done, killing him in cold blood would destroy Caleb as surely as it would end Langford's life. Catherine moved then, a sudden jerky motion that made both Caleb and Evelyn startle. But she wasn't going for a weapon. She was pulling something from her own bag. Papers, Evelyn realized. Documents. "I have proof," Catherine said, her voice shaking but determined. "Letters, bank records, testimonies from women he's victimized. I've been collecting evidence for months, waiting for the right moment. You don't have to kill him, Agent Mercer. We can destroy him legally, put him away where he can never hurt anyone else. Langford's face went slack with shock. Catherine, what are you— Shut up, she snapped, all the previous tension in her voice now making sense. Shut up, James, or Thomas, or whatever your real name is. I loved you, I actually loved you, and you used that to make me complicit in your schemes. You convinced me the women deserved it, that they were greedy and foolish, and we were just teaching them lessons. But then I started actually talking to some of them, started seeing what you'd done to their lives, and I realized you'd done the same thing to me. You just did it slower, more completely, so I didn't recognize the cage you'd built until I was already locked inside. Her hands were shaking as she held out the papers to Caleb. Take these. It's everything you need to convict him. Names, dates, amounts stolen, copies of his letters using different identities. I've been documenting everything, waiting for someone like you to come along so I could finally get out. Caleb moved cautiously, keeping his gun trained on Langford while reaching for the papers. Evelyn stepped forward to take them from Catherine, giving Caleb's gun hand a clear line of fire. The documents were extensive, months or even years of meticulous record-keeping. Why? Evelyn asked Catherine softly. Why did you keep helping him if you knew what he was doing? Catherine's laugh was bitter. Because I had nowhere else to go. Because he convinced me I was just as guilty as he was, that if he went down, I'd go down with him. Because leaving meant admitting I'd been a fool, that I'd wasted years of my life on a man who saw me as just another tool. Her eyes met Evelyn's. But watching him work on you, seeing him prepare to do to you what he'd done to so many others, I couldn't anymore. I just couldn't. Langford had been silent through this exchange, but now he spoke, his voice lacking all its previous warmth and charm. You stupid bitch! You've destroyed everything. No, Catherine said with surprising strength. You destroyed everything. I'm just making sure everyone knows it. Caleb had pulled out a set of handcuffs from his coat. Langford, turn around, hands behind your back. For a moment, Evelyn thought Langford might refuse, might force the confrontation to its logical, violent conclusion. But something in Caleb's eyes must have convinced him that the Pinkerton agent was perfectly willing to pull that trigger, because he complied, turning slowly and placing his hands behind his back. The click of the handcuffs closing felt like the end of something, not just the case, but something larger. Years of hunting, years of grief and anger and determination, coming to fruition in a dusty stage stop in the middle of Wyoming territory. Thomas Langford, Caleb said formally, you are under arrest for multiple counts of fraud, theft by deception, and conspiracy to commit fraud. Additional charges may be filed pending investigation of your activities. You will be transported to Cheyenne to await trial. Do you understand these charges? Langford said nothing, his face carved from stone. Caleb looked at Jacobson, who was still standing frozen behind his counter. I'll need you to witness this arrest and sign a statement, and I'll need your cooperation regarding the mail fraud he committed through your establishment. I didn't know, Jacobson stammered. I swear, Agent Mercer, I didn't know what he was doing. He just offered me money for information, said he was trying to help a lady friend. We'll sort that out later, Caleb cut him off. Right now, I need you to prepare a room where I can secure the prisoner until I can arrange transport. As Jacobson hurried to comply, Evelyn turned to Catherine. What will happen to you? I don't know, the woman admitted. I suppose that depends on whether Agent Mercer believes I was a victim or an accomplice. Probably both, if I'm honest. Caleb glanced at her, his expression unreadable. You'll need to make a full statement, testify at trial. If what you're saying is true, if you have real evidence against him, the prosecutor might offer you immunity in exchange for cooperation. I'll do whatever it takes, Catherine said. I just want this to be over. Evelyn understood that feeling completely. The need for closure, for the story to finally reach its ending so that something new could begin. She'd been living in the aftermath of Langford's betrayal for weeks now, her life suspended in a kind of limbo. Now, watching him in handcuffs, seeing the monster stripped of his charm and reduced to just another criminal, she felt something inside her begin to shift. It wasn't quite healing. That would take time, maybe years. But it was the possibility of healing, the first tentative step toward reclaiming herself from the wreckage he'd made of her life. Caleb secured Langford in a back room, with Jacobson standing nervous guard. Then he returned to where Evelyn and Catherine waited. The papers Catherine had provided spread on the table between them. "This is good work," he said to Catherine, leafing through the documents. "Thorough, organized, exactly what we need. How long have you been compiling this?" 8 months, Catherine said. "Since I realized what I'd gotten myself into and started looking for a way out. I knew I couldn't just leave. He'd find me, convince me to come back, or worse. I needed leverage, insurance. So I started documenting everything." "Did he know you were doing this?" "No. He thought I was just helping him keep records, stay organized. He never suspected I was building a case against him." Caleb nodded slowly, then looked at Evelyn. "You all right?" The question was simple, but weighted with concern that went beyond professional duty. Evelyn realized he was asking not just about her physical safety, but about everything else. Her emotional state, her ability to process what had just happened, her readiness for what would come next. "I'm fine," she said, and was surprised to find it was mostly true. "Or I will be." "Caleb, we did it. We actually caught him." "You did it?" Caleb corrected. "Your plan, your bravery. I just provided backup." "We both did it," Evelyn insisted. "And Catherine. Without her evidence, he might have found a way to slip free on technicalities." Catherine looked between them, understanding dawning. "You two weren't together before this? This really was a trap?" "We met the day after Langford abandoned Evelyn at this stage stop," Caleb explained. "I've been tracking him for years, trying to prevent what he did to my sister from happening to anyone else. When I found Evelyn, we decided to work together." "Your sister?" Catherine's face crumbled. "Oh God, was she—" "Caroline Mercer," Caleb said quietly. "He called himself Jonathan Fairfax when he conned her. She died in Sacramento 2 years ago, alone and penniless because he'd taken everything she had." Catherine sat down heavily, her face in her hands. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. "I'm so sorry. I didn't know about her specifically, but I knew there were others, women whose lives he'd destroyed. And I kept helping him anyway, telling myself it wasn't my fault, that I was just as much a victim as they were." "You were a victim," Evelyn said, surprising herself with the certainty in her voice. "What he did to you was different than what he did to the rest of us. But it was still manipulation, still abuse. He isolated you, made you dependent on him, convinced you that you were complicit so you'd be too afraid to leave. That's not partnership, Catherine. That's captivity." The other woman looked up, tears streaming down her face. "How can you say that? How can you be kind to me after what I helped him do?" "Because I've had time to think about how he operates," Evelyn said. "How he finds the vulnerable places in people and exploits them. You're not evil, Catherine. You're just another one of his victims. The difference is you found the strength to fight back, to help us stop him. That takes courage." They spent the next several hours giving statements, sorting through Catherine's documents, and making arrangements for Langford's transport to Cheyenne. A deputy from the nearest town arrived by late afternoon, summoned by one of Jacobson's staff, and took custody of the prisoner. Caleb would ride with them to ensure Langford actually made it to jail. He clearly didn't trust anyone else with this responsibility. Before they left, Caleb pulled Evelyn aside. "You should come with us. You'll need to give official testimony, and it would be safer to do it in Cheyenne, where there's proper law enforcement." "I will," Evelyn promised. "But not today. I need a moment to breathe, Caleb, to process everything that just happened. I'll come to Cheyenne tomorrow, I swear, but right now I need to not be in motion for just a little while." He studied her face, then nodded slowly. "All right. But Evie? Thank you for everything, for your courage, your intelligence, your willingness to risk yourself for something that mattered. Caroline would have liked you." The words broke something open inside Evelyn, and she found herself crying, not from grief or fear, but from relief and exhaustion, and the overwhelming sense that something monumental had been accomplished. Caleb pulled her into an embrace, and she let herself lean into his strength for just a moment before pulling back and wiping her eyes. "Go," she said. "Make sure he doesn't escape. Make sure justice actually happens this time." "Count on it," Caleb said grimly. She watched them ride out, Caleb, the deputy, and Langford shackled on a horse between them. Catherine went with them too, under a kind of informal protective custody until her exact legal status could be determined. And then Evelyn was alone at the stage stop again, just as she'd been weeks ago. But everything was different now. She wasn't the naive woman who'd arrived here expecting to meet her future husband. She wasn't even the broken woman Caleb had found crying on a bench, her dreams in ruins around her. She was someone new, forged in the crucible of betrayal and hardship, and the decision to fight back rather than simply accept victimhood. The stage would come in the morning, just as it always did. But Evelyn found she had no interest in taking it back to Philadelphia. That life was gone, as surely as if it had never existed. The woman who'd lived there, who'd managed her careful existence with such prudent attention to safety and security, had died the moment she'd made the decision to come west. What would rise from those ashes, Evelyn didn't yet know, but she was curious to find out. She spent the night in her small room at the stage stop, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, she slept deeply and dreamlessly. When she woke, the sun was already high, and she realized she'd missed the stage's departure. But she felt no panic, no regret. Instead, she dressed carefully, packed her few belongings, and went to find Jacobson. "I need to hire a horse," she told him. "I'm riding to Cheyenne." "Alone?" Jacobson looked doubtful. "Miss Porter, that's a long journey, and potentially dangerous." "I'll be fine," Evelyn interrupted. "I've learned I'm more capable than I thought. Now, about that horse?" An hour later, she was on the road, riding the same dappled gray mare Caleb had loaned her weeks ago. The journey would take 2 days, maybe 3, depending on conditions. She had enough money for food and lodging, and Caleb had taught her the basics of frontier travel during their time surveilling the stage stop. She would make it to Cheyenne. She would give her testimony. She would see Thomas Langford face justice for his crimes. And then, maybe, she would figure out who Evelyn Porter was meant to become in this new life she was building from the ruins of the old. The Wyoming sky stretched endlessly above her, vast and blue and full of possibility. And for the first time since this whole nightmare began, Evelyn Porter smiled. The ride to Cheyenne took 3 days instead of 2, but Evelyn didn't mind. She traveled at her own pace, stopping when she wanted, camping under stars that seemed close enough to touch. The solitude should have frightened her. A woman alone on the frontier was vulnerable in ways she'd been raised to fear, but instead she found it liberating. Every mile she traveled was a mile she'd chosen. Every decision was hers alone to make. After months of being manipulated, of having her choices shaped by Langford's carefully crafted lies, the simple act of autonomy felt revolutionary. She reached Cheyenne on a crisp autumn afternoon, the town sprawling before her with its mix of rough frontier architecture and newer buildings that aspired to Eastern sophistication. The streets were busy with cattle traders, miners, railroad workers, and the occasional elegant lady stepping carefully around the mud and manure. It was chaotic and alive and nothing like the orderly streets of Philadelphia, and Evelyn found herself captivated by it. Caleb had told her to meet him at the Pinkerton office on Ferguson Street, so she asked directions from a helpful shopkeeper and navigated her way through the crowded thoroughfares. The office was modest, a second-floor suite above a dry goods store, but the sign on the door carried weight. Pinkerton National Detective Agency. We never sleep. She climbed the stairs and knocked, suddenly nervous in a way she hadn't been while facing down Langford. This was official now, real in ways that their surveillance and trap had somehow not felt. She was about to give sworn testimony that would help put a man in prison, possibly for the rest of his life. The responsibility of that settled heavy on her shoulders. Caleb opened the door himself, and his face split into a genuine smile when he saw her. "Evie, I was starting to worry you'd changed your mind about coming." "I told you I would," she said, returning his smile. "I just needed an extra day on the road." He ushered her into a room that was equal parts office and war room. Maps covered one wall, pinned with markers and notes. Filing cabinets lined another. A large desk dominated the center space, covered in papers and documents that Evelyn recognized as Catherine's evidence. 2 other men were present, one a distinguished older gentleman in a suit, the other younger and clearly another field agent like Caleb. "Miss Porter," the older man said, standing to greet her. "I'm William Sterling, Regional Director for Pinkerton. Agent Mercer has told me a great deal about you. Your assistance in apprehending Thomas Langford has been invaluable." I'm glad I could help, Evelyn said, shaking his offered hand. Has he been formally charged? Multiple counts, Sterling confirmed. Mail fraud, theft by deception, conspiracy to commit fraud, and we're investigating whether we can make a case for manslaughter in relation to Caroline Mercer's death. The prosecutor believes we have a strong case, particularly with the documentation Miss Wells provided. How is Catherine? Evelyn asked. Is she being charged as well? Sterling exchanged a glance with Caleb before responding. That's still being determined. She's cooperating fully, and her testimony will be crucial to securing convictions on all counts. The prosecutor is inclined to offer her immunity in exchange for that cooperation, but there are some who feel she should face consequences for her role in Langford's schemes. She was a victim, Evelyn said firmly. Maybe not in the same way the rest of us were, but he manipulated her just as thoroughly. She found the courage to fight back and help us stop him. That should count for something. Your opinion will carry weight, Sterling said. As one of his victims, your perspective on Miss Wells' culpability matters, but that's a conversation for later. Right now, I need you to give a complete statement about your interactions with Langford, starting from the first letter you received. The process took hours. Evelyn walked them through every detail she could remember, the timing of letters, the specific phrases Langford had used, the photograph that wasn't him, the request for money, the instructions to meet him at Jacobson's stage stop. Sterling took meticulous notes while the younger agent recorded everything in shorthand. Caleb sat quietly to the side, occasionally asking clarifying questions, but mostly just listening. When she finally finished, her throat was raw and her head ached. Sterling reviewed his notes, asked a few follow-up questions, then nodded with satisfaction. This is excellent, Miss Porter. Combined with Miss Wells' documentation and the testimony of other victims we've located, I'm confident we can secure a conviction. Langford will spend the rest of his life in prison. What about the other women? Evelyn asked. The ones he victimized before me? Have they been notified? We're in the process of contacting everyone we can identify, Sterling said. Some, like Martha Hennessy in Denver, we've already spoken to. Others are proving more difficult to locate. Langford was careful to target women who were isolated, who might not have strong social networks to fall back on. But we're doing our best to reach them all. Let them know justice is finally being served. The thought of those other women, her sisters in victimhood scattered across the territories, made Evelyn's chest tight. I'd like to help with that if I can. Reaching out to them, I mean. It might be easier coming from someone who's been through the same thing. Sterling looked surprised, then thoughtful. That's a generous offer, Miss Porter. Let me discuss it with the prosecutor and see if there's a role for you in the notification process. But first, you should rest. You've had a long journey, and you've done more than your share already. Caleb stood. I'll make sure Miss Porter gets settled. There's a decent boarding house 2 blocks from here. Respectable place, run by a widow named Mrs. Henderson. She keeps clean rooms and sets a good table. Sterling nodded approval. Get some rest, Miss Porter. We'll talk more tomorrow about next steps. Outside, the afternoon had faded into evening, the streets emptying as people headed home for dinner. Caleb walked beside Evelyn, leading her horse, comfortable in the silence between them. It was only when they reached the boarding house that he spoke. You did well in there. I know giving that statement couldn't have been easy, reliving everything. It wasn't, Evelyn admitted. But it also felt important. Like I was taking back the narrative, making my voice part of the official record. Does that make sense? Complete sense. Caleb helped her dismount, then handed the reins to a stable boy with instructions for the horse's care. Evie, I need to tell you something. The trial is going to take months to prepare. Langford has hired expensive lawyers. Apparently he has money hidden away that we haven't located yet. His defense team will try every trick they can think of to get the charges dismissed or reduced. It's going to be a long, ugly process. I understand, Evelyn said. I'm prepared for that. Are you prepared for them to attack your character? Because they will. They'll paint you as a gold digger, a woman who came west looking for easy money and is now embarrassed that her scheme failed. They'll suggest you're lying for attention or for revenge, or because you're working with Pinkerton for some kind of financial gain. The warning made Evelyn's stomach clench, but she forced herself to meet Caleb's eyes. Will they do the same thing to the other women? Probably. It's standard defense strategy in cases like this. Discredit the victims, make the jury doubt their testimony. Then I'm definitely prepared, Evelyn said firmly. Because if standing up there and letting Langford's lawyers attack me means that he goes to prison and can never do this to anyone else, then I can handle whatever they throw at me. I'm not the fragile woman I was when I first arrived at that stage stop, Caleb. I'm stronger now. Something shifted in his expression, pride maybe, or respect, or something deeper that he wasn't quite ready to name. Yes, he said quietly. You are. Mrs. Henderson's boarding house was everything Caleb had promised, clean, respectable, and welcoming in a no-nonsense frontier way. The widow herself was a handsome woman in her 50s, who took one look at Evelyn's travel-worn state and immediately ordered hot water for a bath and a tray of food sent up to her room. You look like you've been through hell and back, dear, she said, with the kind of frank compassion Evelyn was learning to appreciate about Western women. Get yourself cleaned up and fed, and then sleep as long as you need. Everything else can wait until tomorrow. Evelyn followed that advice gratefully, soaking away the dust and strain of travel, eating her first proper meal in days, and then falling into the soft bed with a sigh of relief. She expected to lie awake worrying about the trial, about what came next, about all the uncertainties still facing her. Instead, she slept like the dead and woke to bright sunlight streaming through her window. The days that followed fell into a routine that was almost comfortable. Evelyn met regularly with Sterling and the prosecutor, refining her testimony and reviewing evidence. She was introduced to 3 other women Langford had victimized: Martha Hennessy from Denver, a woman named Sarah Chen, who was Elizabeth's cousin and wanted justice for her lost relative, and Jane Morrison from Kansas City, who'd lost her teaching position after Langford's con had left her destitute. The 4 of them formed an unlikely alliance bound by shared trauma, but also by a fierce determination to see Langford pay for his crimes. They met for coffee, shared their stories, cried together and raged together, and slowly helped each other begin to heal. It was the first time since her parents' deaths that Evelyn felt like she had real friends, people who understood her not because they'd known her before the disaster, but because they'd walked through similar fires. Catherine Wells was released on her own recognizance after the prosecutor officially granted her immunity in exchange for testimony. She was staying at the same boarding house as Evelyn, and the 2 women developed a cautious friendship that surprised them both. Catherine was broken in ways that would take years to repair, carrying guilt for her complicity in Langford's schemes that no amount of legal immunity could absolve. But she was also trying to rebuild, to figure out who she was separate from the man who'd controlled her for so long. I don't know what to do, Catherine confessed one evening as they sat in the boarding house parlor doing needlework by lamplight. I have no family to return to, no prospects, no real skills beyond helping Langford con innocent women. What kind of future is there for someone like me? The same kind of future as the rest of us, Evelyn said. Uncertain, frightening, but also full of possibility. We get to decide who we become now, Catherine. We're not defined by what he did to us, unless we choose to be. How can you be so calm about it? Catherine asked, frustration evident in her voice. Don't you wake up angry? Don't you want to scream at the unfairness of it all? Every single day, Evelyn admitted. But I've learned that anger is only useful if you channel it into action. Otherwise, it just consumes you from the inside out. So yes, I'm angry. But I'm using that anger to fuel my determination to see this through, to help other women avoid what happened to us, to build something new from the wreckage. Catherine was quiet for a moment, her needle moving in and out of the fabric. You're going to stay out here, aren't you? In the West, I mean. You're not going back to Philadelphia. No, Evelyn said, realizing as she spoke that the decision had been made somewhere along the way without her consciously choosing it. There's nothing for me back there. Everything I was, everything I had, it's gone. But here, I can be someone new, someone stronger. What will you do? I don't know yet, but I'll figure it out. The conversation was interrupted by a knock at the parlor door. Mrs. Henderson poked her head in. Miss Porter, you have a visitor. Mr. Mercer is asking to see you. Evelyn set aside her needlework and found Caleb waiting in the front hall, hat in hand, looking uncharacteristically uncertain. Sorry to disturb your evening. I wanted to talk to you about something, if you have a moment. Of course. Should we walk? They strolled through the evening streets, the air crisp with the promise of coming winter. Cheyenne at night was a different creature than during the day, quieter, softer around the edges, with lamplight spilling golden from windows and the distant sound of a piano playing in a saloon somewhere. "I've been offered a new case," Caleb said, after they'd walked in silence for a few minutes. "Railroad robbery up in Montana. Good pay, probably several months of work. Sterling wants me to take it." "But you're hesitating," Evelyn observed. "I've been hunting Langford for so long that I'm not sure what to do with myself now that he's caught. The case gave me purpose, direction. Without it—" He trailed off, staring at something in the distance. "Without it, you have to figure out who Caleb Mercer is when he's not seeking vengeance for his sister's death," Evelyn finished gently. He looked at her sharply, then slowly nodded. "Something like that, yeah. The ranch needs attention. I've been neglecting it for years, leaving Sam and Tommy to handle everything while I chased ghosts. Maybe it's time to go home, actually try to build the life Caroline would have wanted me to have." "That sounds healthy," Evelyn said. "Scary, but healthy. What about you? Have you thought about what comes next?" Evelyn considered the question carefully. "I want to help the other women. Not just the ones Langford victimized, but women in general who come west unprepared for how hard it can be. I was lucky. I met you before anything worse could happen to me. But there are so many others who aren't that fortunate. Women who get stranded or widowed or conned and have no resources and no support system. I want to do something about that." "What did you have in mind?" "I'm not sure exactly. Maybe some kind of organization that helps women get back on their feet after disasters, provides temporary housing, helps them find employment, offers legal assistance if they've been victimized. It would take funding, and I don't have much capital left, but Mrs. Henderson has been telling me about other women in town who might be interested in supporting something like that." Caleb was quiet, thinking. Then he said, "The ranch has more space than I need. The main house, the guest room you stayed in, even the bunkhouse when Sam and Tommy aren't using it. If you wanted to start something, you could use that as a base. Women could stay there temporarily while they figure out their next steps, work if they want to in exchange for room and board, leave when they're ready. It's isolated enough to offer safety and privacy, but close enough to town to access resources." Evelyn stopped walking, turning to face him fully. "Caleb, are you seriously offering me your ranch as a haven for displaced women?" "I'm offering partnership," he corrected. "You'd run the operation. I'm not equipped for that kind of work emotionally or practically, but I can provide the physical space, some financial backing to get started, protection if anyone needs it. And when I'm not off on cases, I can help with the practical side, repairs, transportation, dealing with any problems that need a man's authority to solve, unfortunately." "Why?" Evelyn asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why would you do this?" Caleb met her eyes, and in the lamplight she could see the vulnerability there, the grief he still carried for his sister mixed with something newer and more hopeful. "Because Caroline deserved someone to care when she needed help, and she didn't get it. I can't change that. But I can make sure other women do get that support. And because you're right, you're not the fragile woman I found at that stage stop. You're someone who survived something terrible and came out stronger, someone who wants to use that strength to help others. I admire that, Evie. I want to support it however I can." The offer was so unexpected, so generous, that Evelyn felt tears pricking her eyes. This wasn't romance. Caleb wasn't proposing marriage or even courtship. He was proposing something better, partnership, mutual respect, shared purpose, a foundation to build something meaningful on. "I'd need to work out the details," she said slowly. "Talk to the other women, see who might want to be involved. Figure out funding and logistics and legal structures. It could take months to set up properly." "Take the time you need," Caleb said. "The ranch isn't going anywhere, and neither am I. Well, I might be in Montana for a while, but you know what I mean." Evelyn laughed despite the tears now flowing freely down her cheeks. "You're a good man, Caleb Mercer. Your sister would be proud of you." "I hope so," he said softly. "I really do hope so." The trial began in early December, when winter had settled over Cheyenne with serious intent. The courthouse was packed every day with newspaper reporters from as far away as San Francisco covering what had become known as the romance fraud case. Langford sat at the defense table looking distinguished and wronged, his expensive lawyers painting him as a victim of misunderstanding and vindictive women. But the prosecution had evidence that couldn't be explained away. Catherine's documentation was damning. Letters in Langford's handwriting using multiple identities, bank records showing suspicious transfers, testimonies from dozens of witnesses who'd seen him with different women in different towns. The prosecution called victim after victim to the stand, each woman telling her story of betrayal and loss. When it was Evelyn's turn to testify, she walked to the witness stand with her head high and her voice steady. Langford's lawyer tried to rattle her, suggesting she'd been a willing participant in some kind of scheme, that she'd known all along what she was getting into and was now crying victim for attention. Mr. Langford presented himself as an honest rancher looking for an educated wife, Evelyn said calmly. He quoted poetry, discussed philosophy, created the illusion of a thoughtful, cultured man. The persona he crafted was designed specifically to appeal to women like me, educated, independent, careful. If I'd received letters from someone who seemed too good to be true, I would have been suspicious. But Mr. Langford was smart enough to include flaws in his character, to mention difficulties and challenges, to make himself seem real. That's what made him so dangerous, and that's why so many intelligent women fell for his lies. The lawyer tried to press her further, but Evelyn held her ground, refusing to be shamed or intimidated. When she finally stepped down from the witness stand, she caught Caleb's eye in the gallery. He nodded once, a small gesture of approval and respect, and Evelyn felt a surge of pride. She'd done it. She'd faced her attacker in open court and refused to let him make her small. The other women testified with similar strength. Martha Hennessy, who'd lost everything and rebuilt from nothing, spoke about the long-term impact of Langford's fraud on her ability to trust anyone. Sarah Chen read a letter her cousin Elizabeth had written before walking into the desert, a heartbreaking document that had the entire courtroom in tears. Jane Morrison detailed how Langford's con had cost her not just money, but her teaching career and her reputation in her community. And then Catherine Wells took the stand, and the entire dynamic shifted. She was a devastating witness, speaking with brutal honesty about how Langford had groomed her over years, slowly drawing her into his schemes by making her feel complicit, making her believe she couldn't leave because she was just as guilty as he was. She detailed his methods in clinical detail, how he researched potential victims, how he crafted different personas for different women, how he moved money through various banks to avoid detection. She even produced a journal she'd kept, recording his techniques with an almost academic detachment. "Why did you keep this journal?" the prosecutor asked. "Because I was looking for a way out," Catherine said, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. "Because I knew what we were doing was wrong, but I felt trapped. So I documented everything, thinking that maybe someday I'd be brave enough to turn him in, or someone would catch him and I'd have evidence to offer. I wanted insurance, but I also wanted proof that I wasn't crazy, that what was happening to me was real manipulation and not just my imagination." Langford's lawyers tried to discredit her, painting her as a scorned lover seeking revenge. But Catherine refused to be shaken, calmly responding to every attack with facts and documentation that couldn't be disputed. The trial lasted 3 weeks. In the end, the jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts. Langford was sentenced to 20 years in the territorial prison, with additional charges pending in other jurisdictions. It wasn't everything. It would never bring back Caroline Mercer or Elizabeth Chen, would never fully restore what had been taken from all his victims. But it was justice, real and concrete and permanent. Outside the courthouse, Evelyn stood with the other women, all of them crying and laughing and holding on to each other in the cold December air. Reporters shouted questions, but Evelyn ignored them, focused entirely on this moment of collective triumph. They'd done it. They'd faced their abuser in court, told their truths, and seen justice prevail. Caleb emerged from the courthouse and made his way through the crowd to where Evelyn stood. He didn't say anything, just pulled her into an embrace that she returned fiercely, both of them holding on as if anchoring each other against a storm. "Thank you," she whispered into his shoulder, "for everything, for finding me, for believing me, for helping make this happen." "You did this," he said firmly, pulling back to look at her. "All of you. I just provided the badge and the resources. The courage was all yours." The winter passed in a blur of planning and preparation. Evelyn worked with Martha, Sarah, and Jane to develop a formal structure for what they were calling the Frontier Women's Aid Society. Catherine, seeking redemption through action, threw herself into the project as well, using her organizational skills to help establish procedures and protocols. They secured funding from several wealthy women in Cheyenne who'd been moved by the trial coverage, and within 3 months they'd opened their first shelter in the main house of Mercer Ranch. Caleb was in Montana on his railroad case, but he'd left instructions with Sam and Tommy to provide whatever support the women needed. The two ranch hands took to the expanded household with surprising grace, treating the temporary residents with respectful deference and helping with heavy labor when needed. The first woman they helped was a widow from Kansas whose husband had died in a mining accident, leaving her alone with 3 children and no resources. She stayed at the ranch for 2 months while Evelyn helped her find employment as a seamstress and secured housing in town. The second was a young woman who'd been abandoned by a man claiming to be her husband after he'd already married someone else. The third was an immigrant from Germany who spoke almost no English and had been stranded when the family she'd been traveling with continued west without her. By spring, they'd helped more than a dozen women, and word was spreading across the territory. Newspapers ran favorable articles about the society, praising the women's innovative approach to a growing problem. Letters arrived from women as far away as California and Texas, asking for help or offering support. Evelyn discovered she was good at this work. The combination of practical problem-solving and emotional support came naturally to her. She learned to assess what each woman needed, whether it was temporary shelter, job training, legal assistance, or simply someone to listen to her story without judgment. She learned to navigate the complex web of territorial law and social services, to negotiate with potential employers on behalf of women who had no leverage, to build networks of support that could catch people before they fell too far. It was exhausting and sometimes heartbreaking work. Not every story had a happy ending. Some women were too damaged by their experiences to accept help. Others had problems too complex to be solved with temporary shelter and job assistance. But enough of them found their footing, rebuilt their lives, moved forward into futures that had seemed impossible when they'd first arrived at the ranch. Those successes made everything else worthwhile. Caleb returned from Montana in late April, his case successfully concluded, and another criminal behind bars. Evelyn was in the barn office. She'd taken it over completely now, transforming it into the administrative center for the society, when he arrived. She looked up from the correspondence she was reviewing to find him standing in the doorway, weathered from months on the trail but smiling. "The place looks different," he observed. "Busier." "We've had 19 women stay here since December," Evelyn reported, unable to keep the pride from her voice. 14 have moved on to independent situations. 3 are still here, working and saving money. 2 decided to return to their families back east, and we helped arrange their passage. "That's remarkable, Evie. You've built something real here." "We've built something," she corrected. "This wouldn't exist without your support, without you believing in the idea enough to offer your home." Caleb stepped into the office, looking around at the organized filing system, the charts tracking residents and resources, the correspondence from women seeking help and donors offering support. "Caroline would have loved this," he said quietly. "She always talked about creating opportunities for women, about building systems that could catch people when they fell. This is exactly the kind of work she dreamed of doing." "Then we're doing it in her honor," Evelyn said. "Every woman we help, every life we change. That's Caroline's legacy, as much as it's ours." They fell into a comfortable routine over the weeks that followed. Caleb handled the ranch work and provided security and support for the society. Evelyn managed the shelter program and continued expanding their network. They worked together easily, anticipating each other's needs and communication styles, building something that was greater than the sum of its parts. The other women noticed, of course. Martha took to calling them the most unmarried married couple in Wyoming, which made Evelyn blush and Caleb studiously avoid commenting. But the truth was, their relationship had evolved into something neither of them quite knew how to name. It wasn't romance in the traditional sense. There were no passionate declarations or stolen kisses, but there was intimacy nonetheless, the deep knowledge that came from shared purpose and mutual respect. They took long walks together in the evenings, discussing the day's challenges and planning for the future. They sat by the fire after everyone else had gone to bed, sometimes talking, sometimes simply existing in comfortable silence. They knew each other's fears and dreams, their wounds and their healing, their darkness and their light. It was Catherine who finally forced the issue, cornering Evelyn in the kitchen one morning while Caleb was out checking fence lines. "You're in love with him," she said without preamble. "And unless I'm completely misreading things, which I'm not, he's in love with you too. So why are you both pretending otherwise?" Evelyn's hands stilled in the bread dough she was kneading. "It's not that simple, Catherine." "Why not? You're both single adults. You clearly care about each other. You work well together. What's complicated about that? Everything we've built here is based on partnership, on mutual respect and shared goals. If we introduce romance into that, it changes the dynamic. What happens if things don't work out? What happens to the society, to all the women depending on us, if our personal relationship falls apart?" Catherine leaned against the counter, studying her friend's face. "You're scared," she said softly, "and I understand why. Langford taught all of us to be terrified of trust, of vulnerability, of opening ourselves up to the possibility of being hurt again. But Evie, Caleb isn't Langford. He's proven that over and over. He found you at your lowest point and helped you stand back up without demanding anything in return. He supported your dreams, respected your autonomy, treated you as an equal partner. That's not manipulation. That's just love." The words hit Evelyn with unexpected force. She'd been so focused on rebuilding herself, on proving she was strong and independent and didn't need anyone, that she'd missed what was right in front of her. Caleb had been showing her love through actions for months now, the quiet support, the unwavering belief in her capabilities, the way he made space for her to become who she was meant to be. And she loved him back. Not the desperate, needy love she'd thought she felt for Thomas Langford, but something deeper and more real. A love built on knowledge and respect, on shared trauma and shared purpose, on the slow accumulation of ordinary moments that added up to extraordinary partnership. "What do I do?" Evelyn asked, her voice barely audible. "You tell him," Catherine said simply. "You take the risk, knowing it might not work out perfectly, trusting that whatever happens, you'll both handle it with the same grace and maturity you've shown in everything else. You deserve happiness, Evie. You both do. Don't let fear steal that from you." That evening, Evelyn asked Caleb to walk with her to their usual spot, a rise overlooking the valley where they'd first talked about creating the society. The spring air was soft and warm, carrying the scent of new grass and wildflowers. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades that reminded Evelyn of that first sunset at Jacobson's stage stop, when her life had been at its lowest point. How far she'd come since then. How much she'd changed. "I need to tell you something," she said, her heart pounding so hard she was certain Caleb could hear it. "And I need you to just listen until I'm finished, because if you interrupt, I might lose my courage." Caleb's expression shifted to concern, but he nodded. "All right." Evelyn took a deep breath. "When you found me at that stage stop, I was broken. Not just financially, though I was certainly that too, but emotionally, spiritually. Langford had taken everything I thought I knew about myself and shattered it. I didn't trust my own judgment anymore. I didn't trust anyone or anything. I was drowning, Caleb, and I didn't even realize it until you threw me a lifeline." She paused, gathering her thoughts. "Over these months, you've helped me rebuild myself into someone stronger than I ever was before. You've believed in me when I didn't believe in myself. You've supported my dreams without trying to control them. You've treated me as an equal partner in building something that matters, and somewhere along the way, I fell in love with you." Caleb drew in a sharp breath, but he didn't interrupt, honoring her request. "I'm terrified to tell you this," Evelyn continued, her voice trembling now, "because what if I'm wrong? What if I'm misreading friendship for something more? What if loving you means losing this partnership we've built, this work that matters so much? But I'm more terrified of never telling you, of letting fear dictate my choices the way I did when I trusted Langford's lies. So here's the truth. As scary as it is, I love you, Caleb Mercer. Not because you saved me, but because of who you are. Your integrity, your strength, your gentleness with wounded things, the way you carry your grief with dignity, the way you've transformed your pain into purpose. I love all of it, all of you.
And I needed you to know that even if you don't feel the same way. She finally fell silent, her heart in her throat, waiting for his response. Caleb was staring at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Surprise, certainly, but also something else. Something that made hope flutter in her chest. "Evie," he said finally, his voice rough with emotion. "Can I talk now?" She nodded, not trusting her voice. "I've been in love with you for months," he said simply. "Probably since that night we camped under the stars on the way back from Jacobson's, when you asked me about Caroline and actually listened to my answer, really heard what I was saying. I've been in love with your courage, your resilience, the way you refused to let what Langford did define who you became. I've watched you transform pain into purpose, watched you build something beautiful from the ruins of your life, and I've been in awe of you every single day." He stepped closer, his hands coming up to frame her face with a gentleness that made tears spring to her eyes. "But I didn't say anything because I was afraid too. Afraid you'd think I was taking advantage of your vulnerability. Afraid of ruining what we'd built together. Afraid that loving you meant I was trying to replace what Langford destroyed, when what I really wanted was to stand beside you as you created something entirely new." "Caleb," Evelyn whispered, his name a prayer and a promise. "I love you," he said, his storm gray eyes holding hers with an intensity that stole her breath. "Not because I saved you. You saved yourself, Evie. You did that. But because you're brilliant and brave and you make me want to be better than I am. Because you understand grief without being consumed by it. Because you've taken your worst experiences and used them to help others. Because when I imagine my future, every version of it has you in it." Evelyn was crying openly now, but these were tears of joy, of relief, of the overwhelming sweetness of being truly seen and loved for exactly who she was. "So what do we do now?" she asked. Caleb smiled, that rare, full smile that transformed his entire face. "Whatever we want. We can take this slow, figure things out as we go. We can keep building the society and see where this leads us. Or," he paused, suddenly looking uncertain, "or we could get married, make this partnership official in every way. I'm not trying to rush you. We have all the time in the world. But I want you to know that's what I want eventually, Evie. A life with you. A future built together. Whatever shape that takes." "I want that too," Evelyn said, and felt the rightness of it settle into her bones. This wasn't the desperate grab for security she'd made with Langford. This was a conscious choice made from strength, not weakness. A partnership of equals who'd chosen each other with full knowledge and open eyes. "But let's take our time. Let's court properly, get to know each other outside of crisis and trauma. Let's build something sustainable." "That sounds perfect," Caleb agreed. Then, with a hesitancy that was somehow endearing, he asked, "May I kiss you?" Evelyn laughed, giddy with happiness and relief and the sheer rightness of this moment. "Yes," she said. "Yes, you absolutely may." The kiss was gentle at first, tentative, both of them learning each other, but it deepened into something more passionate, more certain, both of them pouring months of unspoken feeling into the contact. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, Evelyn felt like she was glowing from the inside out. "No more waiting," she whispered, echoing the words Caleb had said to her all those months ago at the stage stop. "No more waiting," he agreed, pulling her close again. "Just moving forward, together." They stood there as the sun completed its descent, wrapped in each other's arms, looking out over the valley that had become home. Somewhere below them, the ranch house glowed with lamplight, sheltering women who were rebuilding their lives just as Evelyn had rebuilt hers. The Frontier Women's Aid Society was thriving, making a real difference in the lives of vulnerable women across the territory. And here, on this hilltop, two wounded people had found healing and hope and love in the most unexpected of places. The Frontier had taken so much from both of them, but it had also given them each other, given them purpose, given them the chance to transform their pain into something that would help others avoid similar suffering. Caroline Mercer would never know what her brother had built in her honor, but her spirit lived on in every woman they helped, every life they changed. As stars began to emerge in the darkening sky, Caleb took Evelyn's hand. "Ready to head back?" She nodded, but paused for one more moment to take in the view, the vast Wyoming landscape that had seemed so harsh and unforgiving when she'd first arrived,
but which she now understood could be beautiful too, for those who had eyes to see it. "I'm ready," she said finally, "for all of it, the work, the challenges, the future, as long as we face it together." "Together," Caleb agreed, squeezing her hand. "Always." They walked down the hill hand in hand toward the lights of home and the life they were building together. Behind them, the last light faded from the sky, but ahead the lamps burned bright and welcoming. There would be challenges still. There always were. More women to help, more battles to fight, more healing to do. But they would face it all side by side, partners in every sense of the word. Evelyn Porter had come west expecting to find a husband and a ranch. Instead, she'd found herself, stronger, wiser, more capable than she'd ever imagined possible. And along the way, she'd found something infinitely more valuable than the false promises in Thomas Langford's letters. She'd found real love, built on truth and respect and shared purpose. She'd found a home, not in a place, but in the work that mattered and the man who stood beside her. She'd found her future, and it was brighter than any dream she'd dared to dream back in Philadelphia. The woman who'd sat crying on that bench at Jacobson's stage stop would barely recognize the woman she'd become. And that, Evelyn thought, as she and Caleb entered their home together, was exactly as it should be. She'd stopped waiting for someone else to give her life meaning. She'd created that meaning herself, on her own terms, in partnership with someone who valued her for exactly who she was. No more waiting, no more tears, just forward motion, purpose, and love. The Wyoming Territory had been harsh with her at first, testing her strength and resolve. But she'd passed every test, emerged from every trial stronger than before. And now, finally, she was home. Not the home she'd imagined, but the one she'd built with her own hands, her own courage, her own refusal to let tragedy define her. As they sat down to dinner with the other women, Evelyn looked around the table at the faces gathered there. Catherine rebuilding her sense of self, Martha planning to open her own business, Sarah working to establish a scholarship in her cousin's name, and half a dozen others in various stages of healing and transformation. This was her family now, chosen rather than inherited. This was her legacy, more valuable than any inheritance her parents had left her. And this was her story, not the one Thomas Langford had tried to write for her, but the one she'd written herself. A story of survival and resilience, of finding strength in the aftermath of betrayal, of transforming pain into purpose. A story that was far from over, with chapters yet to be written and adventures still to come. But for now, in this moment, with Caleb's hand warm in hers and hope bright in her heart, Evelyn Porter was exactly where she was meant to be. The journey that had begun in tears and abandonment had led her here, to this table, this home, this life. And she wouldn't change a single painful step of it, because every hardship had shaped her into someone capable of claiming the happiness she now held. The cowboy had ridden up and said no more waiting, and Evelyn had believed him. She'd stopped waiting for someone else to rescue her and had rescued herself instead, and in doing so, she'd found everything she'd been searching for and so much more. The end.